Ladies and gentlemen, I'm Joseph Atick, Executive Chairman of ID for Africa, and this is LiveCast number 45. Welcome to this special episode featuring a distinguished panel of experts to discuss the vital and timely topic of governance and guidance in digital identity. Digital identity continues to rapidly gain global importance, affecting people's lives profoundly, and it is evident more than ever that its development must go beyond technological considerations to include robust governance. Ensuring how this essential asset is governed, fostering inclusive participation, and empowering stakeholders within appropriate frameworks and institutions are paramount to preventing any harm from this powerful force for change. In this episode, we have the privilege of hearing from three distinguished institutions known for their expertise in digitalization, guidance, and governance. The UNDP, OECD, and NIST. We have organized our discussion into two main segments. In the first, in addition to the structured panels and presentations from the UNDP and OECD, we will hear insights from civil society and government representatives from Kenya and Malawi, as well as from a prominent researcher and policy analyst. In the second segment, we will bring you a series of presentations from the experts at NIST, the organization responsible for one of the most influential guidance documents on digital identity, the NIST Special Publication 800-63. Stay tuned as we explore the depths of digital identity governance and guidance in this episode. But before we proceed, I have a few important announcements to make. First, I would like to reflect on the remarkable events of Identity Day this year. On 16 September 2023, something truly magical happened. On that day, we witnessed mobilization rarely seen before. Words fail to describe the intensity of the day, so we have prepared a video to try to capture a glimpse of what happened on ID Day. Of course, there were countries outside Africa that also commemorated, but our tracking focused on Africa because of the overwhelming number of activities on the continent. I encourage you to check out the ID Day website to see how extensive the activities were. Visit id-day.org to check out the list of activities. I salute everyone who marked the 5th anniversary of ID Day this year. Their collective voice was loud and clear and reminded the world that identity matters more than ever before. I would also like to acknowledge the 240 coalition partners comprising development agencies, governments, NGOs, civil society, and commercial concerns who are lending their brands and credibility to this cause. Looking forward to an even more expansive and impactful 2024 ID Day commemorations. Second, I'd like to update you on our 2024 Annual General Meeting, AGM, set for May 21st to 24 in the beautiful city of Cape Town, South Africa. This edition holds special significance as it marks the 10th anniversary of ID for Africa and the ID for D movement. Consequently, we have extended the event to 4 days instead of the customary 3. And it will not be hosted officially by any government, as is the tradition. This extended time frame and independence will allow us greater flexibility to delve more deeply into the issues. We will return to AGMs officially hosted by a government in 2025. We announced the theme 2 weeks ago, which was Digital Identity as DPI, Fostering Trust, Inclusion, and Adoption. This theme is underpinned by 4 core pillars at the heart of our identity development agenda. First, we would like to think of identity as an infrastructure. Second, we'd like to underscore the importance of building trust. Third, the emphasis on inclusion is front and center. And of course, we would like to drive use cases so that digital identity has value and impacts the development agenda. While all these elements are vital, one in particular deserves more spotlight for its far-reaching implications and because it has an implication to the delegations present at the event, the composition of the delegations, and that's inclusion. Inclusion here has a double meaning. First, it means ensuring that all stakeholders have a seat at the table when planning for digital identity development and adoption. To achieve this, we are making the 2024 AGM the most inclusive event ever, featuring representations from government, development organizations, parliament members, data protection commissions, the private sector, civil society, and academia. The program will harness this diverse representation to foster a broad and inclusive multi-stakeholder dialogue on a topic that impacts everyone. Of course, inclusion also means inclusive outcomes in the sense that we have to strive to develop DPI that leaves no one behind. It simply is unacceptable for progress to be the exclusive domain of the already privileged. In the next livecast on 15 November, I'll provide more details about the program structure and how it utilizes the 4 days to offer a unique experience and deliver on the expected outcomes. Expect depth and breadth and something for everyone. This is shaping up already to be a cannot-miss event for 2024, not only because it will be the premier ID4D event worldwide, but also because it will be a major gathering on digital identity for all economies globally. For our African attendees, the systematic process of forming delegations has begun. This involves a merit and country need-based selection procedure managed by the ambassadors' bureaus across our 48 member countries for government attendees. Additionally, there is a diversity and inclusion program overseen by the General Secretariat to ensure the right level of participation from civil society and other underrepresented groups. The ambassadors' bureaus and the General Secretariat together are working hard to achieve a fair, diverse, and inclusive representation of qualified delegates from across the continent and across all sectors. For our attendees from outside Africa, please keep an eye out for ongoing updates and the anticipated opening of registration in January. You can visit the event website today and subscribe to receive notifications when registration becomes available. We recommend periodically revisiting that website to stay up to date. It's important to note that the registration will operate on a first-come, first-served basis, and we have a total attendance limit of 2,000 seats, with 800 reserved for African government representatives. Finally, I would like to unveil the topic and the lineup for the next livecast episode, scheduled for November 15. It deals with another hot topic of our times. It is AI and development. AI is already impacting business processes around the world, and identity development is no exception. So join us as we hear the good, the bad, and the undefined in this rapidly evolving saga. and find out how AI will impact the way you conduct your operations and business processes. Registration for this event is now open. You can find the link in the chat or in the description below if you're watching this on YouTube. Now we're ready to start this episode. I'd like to welcome, in the order of appearance, Dr. Sarah Lister, Head of Governance, Bureau of Policy and Program Support, UNDP. Barbara Ubaldi, Head Digital Government and Data Unit, OECD. Nanjira Sambuli, a Researcher Fellow, the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace. Risa, Arai, Program Specialist, Legal Identity, UNDP. Dr. Emrys, Schoemaker, Director, Caribou Digital and Senior Governance Advisor, UNDP. Marianne Díaz Hernández, YID Campaigner, Access Now. Adeboye, Adegoke, Senior Manager, Grants and Program Strategy, Paradigm Initiative. Ambassador Julius Bitok, Principal Secretary, State Department for Citizen Services, Kenya. Mphatso Sambo, Principal Secretary, National Registration Bureau, Malawi, and ID for Africa Ambassador. And from NIST, Ryan Galluzzo, Digital Identity Program Lead, Applied Cybersecurity Division. Connie, LaSalle, Senior Technology Policy Advisor. And David Temoshok, Senior Policy Advisor, Trusted Identities Group. Welcome and thank you to all the panelists for being with us. We truly appreciate your valuable contributions to this livecast and to the cause of responsible identity for all. I look forward to engaging with each of you within the different segments. We're now ready to start the first segment, which is the UNDP Digital Identity Governance Framework. In recent times, we've witnessed substantial advancements in digital legal identity technologies, with several systems and technologies now widely deployed and in use. However, the development of suitable governance frameworks and models has not kept pace with rapid technological progress, but this is beginning to change now. Several digital identity-specific governance frameworks have emerged recently, serving different economies and different contexts. In this segment, we are focused on the UNDP framework, which is the one we thought is most adapted for the development agenda. But there's also the OECD recently launched framework, which is primarily focused on the OECD member states context and in a global fashion. Nevertheless, there are significant areas of overlap. Before we delve into the details of the UNDP Digital Identity Governance Framework and how to use it, I would like to call to the stage Dr. Sarah Lister from UNDP and Barbara Ubaldi from OECD to talk about the development of the respective frameworks and set expectations. Then we will invite Nanjira to join this first panel to get a perspective on technology governance in general. Wonderful. Sarah and Barbara, thank you so much once again for being with us. I'd like to start by asking you to introduce your organizations and also briefly explain how governance of digital identity fits into your areas of responsibility within your organization. So, Sarah, start with you.
Well, thank you very much, Dr. Atick. It's a real pleasure to be here with you and so many online. We really appreciate the invitation. So the United Nations Development Program has been working on issues of legal identity for many years and co-chairs the UN legal identity agenda. But we also have broad programming across a range of governance and digitalization issues, which means we are able to bring those to bear also in relation to our work on legal identity. And what we've seen is, while there are still 850 million people in the world today who don't have the means to prove who they are, as digitalization goes forward in this agenda, it also brings a number of risks. And so we wanted to look at some of those, the governance aspects, which will ensure that digital legal identity remains inclusive, people-centered and rights-based. And that was the foundation and the reason why we worked on this model regulatory framework, which my colleagues will be introducing more later.
We'll discuss this a little bit further. I just wanted to situate sort of the governance of digital identity within the broad organizational mission. Barbara, what about the OECD? Digital identity and governance is becoming a topic that you are focused on. Did we lose Barbara? Let's just give it a few moments while I continue with Sarah, and we'll wait for Barbara to rejoin us. Sarah, oh, there we go. So can you hear me, Barbara?
Hello, everyone. Apologies, I'm dialing in from an airport where I came to talk about digital identity. So be patient with me. Hello, everyone. I think the answer to your question comes from my title, which is the Head of Unit for Digital Government and Data in Government, which is within the Public Governance Directorate at the OECD. So the work on digital identity for us is at the core of the work we do to assist member countries and governments beyond our members to make their digital government stronger. And by stronger, I mean more capable to provide services to citizens and responses through policies which are inclusive and trustworthy. So for us, the big emphasis of the work we're doing on digital identity is on the type of governance that needs to be in place for governments providing solutions to identify people to be able to provide identity as a service, the management of identity as a service. This is why for us it's extremely important to underline that our focus is not on the technological solution, but on the governance that makes it possible for governments to provide a system to identify people that is trustworthy, inclusive, and reliable, which is why for us it's part of the broader work on public governance.
Exactly. And I'm just highlighting the fact that a few years ago, we were not at this position. Now, digital identity is now impacting some of the leading organizations in the world in a topic, in an approach about governance. And it means that we're maturing. The subject is maturing where we need to be. Sarah, what is governance? I mean, just to demystify the subject, give us a sense of what governance is.
Well, it means many things to many people, but for UNDP, we understand it as a system of policies, values, and institutions by which a society manages its economic, political, and social affairs. And it involves interactions between all stakeholders, civil society, state, private sector. So in essence, it's the way that a society organizes itself to make and implement decisions and to gain mutual understanding, agreement, and action. And our understanding really emphasizes the importance of public participation and people's confidence and trust in public institutions at all levels. And I think that element is really important for this discussion as well.
Okay, so I gathered from your answer, Sarah, and I'd like Barbara to build on that. Governance is not just legal frameworks. So Barbara, can you help explain what is the relation and what are the differences between when somebody says we've got legal frameworks and then you can say, but you may not have governance?
Absolutely. And definitely, like you said, we've become much more mature in understanding the importance of digital identity, especially, I think, in the context also of the aftermath of the pandemic, when we realized that the interoperability of systems to identify people for certain purposes had made it easier for people to move around, to move across borders. And here I come to the matter of governance, because governance, truly enough, is not just including the legal and regulatory framework. And the best example, if we think about it, is the European Union, which has been having the eIDAS for many years, and yet the digital identity is not a reality in many European Union countries. Why? Because to make a regulation or a law work, you need to have a system of other elements that work together to create an environment in which the law or the regulation can be implemented. For example, you need to have roles and responsibilities across the public sector. If you want to have a digital identity mechanism, it's not enough to have an institution that coordinates the work, but you need to have around the table the accountability of all the bodies, for example, that hold data which need to be shared to be able for the digital identity solution to work. You need to have mechanisms in place that make it certain and continuous in the length of time, the inclusion and the collaboration with all the stakeholders. Like Sarah mentioned, it's about bringing around the table not only actors within the public sector, but also, for example, the private sector, like you mentioned as well, the academia, but also civil society organizations that represent vulnerable groups across society. So how do you make sure that those mechanisms are not a nice add-on, but they are part of the regular and permanent way for any government to provide a digital identity system? And last but not least, there are all set of, for example, standards that need to be applied to make sure that if we want to have the interoperability of the different parts of the administration that need to be in place, starting with the data, to be able to inform a digital identity system, then we need to start from scratch, speaking the right language and the same language. So it's really a comprehensive set of policy levers that can complement the regulations and even more can make it possible to implement the regulation.
Barbara, just a quick question. Some people in our audience are asking, what does OECD stand for? Could you just give a 30-second introduction to OECD?
Yes. The OECD stands for Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development. We have 38 member countries spread out around the world, but beyond these 38 member countries, we work with, in addition, about 50 countries around the world from all different regions. So it's an organization that focuses on strengthening policies for delivering better services, and therefore we are part of the directorate that focuses on public governance. Therefore, we advise governments on the core functions of the government.
Wonderful. Sarah, now what happens when governance isn't there, when it is lacking? What do you see happening?
Well, in broad terms, rather than specifically related to digital legal identity, I think you only need to kind of turn on your television these days. When there is not effective, accountable, and inclusive governance systems, then there isn't effective mechanisms for society to be engaged in the way that society is organized. People don't have trust in the governance institutions that are trying to organize the societies, and it leads to a breakdown of what we call the social contract. It can harm social cohesion, leading to conflict and violence, and it can also harm very practical aspects of public policy. We saw during the COVID-19 pandemic that in those societies where people didn't trust their authorities, it was much harder to respond as a society to the environment and the need to respond quickly. So trust in governance systems is really important, and that's why for us in the UN and for UNDP, the SDG 16 on peaceful, just and inclusive societies is not only a goal in its own right and a human rights issue, it's also an enabler for the whole of Agenda 2030. And without those types of governance systems, we are not going to be able to support sustainable development. So the conversation we're having this morning is a sort of microcosm of that broader understanding, really, that governance systems need to be inclusive, effective, and accountable to ensure that sustainable development takes place and that no one is left behind.
Barbara, thanks, Sarah. Barbara, how long ago was your practice at OECD, which is sort of digital governance, established? How long ago did OECD recognize and establish governance practice?
The first year was the year 2000. So we started in the year 2000 to work on this, acknowledging the importance for governments to be capable to leverage technologies and data to conduct their operations in a way that is transparent, efficient, innovative, but also provides inclusive results.
And Sarah, at the UN governance at UNDP, how long ago did that?
Probably since the 1960s or 70s, before the start of my working life, and that seems to be several decades long now. So we have had a broad governance practice for decades across and working with some 130 partner countries. Obviously, that practice has shifted and changed during that time, but we do have a long experience of working in our partner countries on governance issues. And
my point is that we're not inventing digital governance as a completely out of the blue new practice.
Absolutely
not. Evolution. It's an evolution of the good practices that have been going on. Most organizations, mature organizations, have had to develop those and evolve them into that. Wonderful. Okay, I want to dial back a little bit and understand from both of your perspectives. Why did you start digital identity governance framework? What motivated, what demand pushed you to do that? And we're going to talk about also the challenges that you faced in developing your respective frameworks. So maybe we can start with Sarah.
Yeah, well, thank you. And I think it refers a little bit back to the first answer. So, you know, we have been working on legal identity for some years, but we are all noting the digitalization processes that are going on in countries. And this was a demand from our country partners. And it also, as we work increasingly on, as UNDP, on what we now call digital public infrastructure, although we didn't call it that a few years ago, it became clear that legal identity and digital legal identity was a foundational part of the digital transformation in societies, which so many of our partner countries have as one of their top priorities. So our work on digital legal identity and the governance frameworks came out of both our legal identity work and our digitalization work, and it's a coming together of those two streams. And the specific sort of focus on the governance frameworks and so forth emerged, as you said, Joseph, from our long understanding and our long history on governance of the importance of having in place those rights-based, people-centered, inclusion-driven mechanisms to ensure that societies are functioning for the well-being of all. So this became, it was both, you know, came out of our long experience in these areas, and also came as a demand from our country partners as they were seeking to move forward in this area.
Yeah, and that's actually wonderful that it wasn't really technology driven. It was fundamentally driven from the considerations of good governance that you've laid out many years ago.
Yeah.
Barbara, I was very sort of pleased to learn about the OECD development process, which we can call bottoms up versus a top-down approach. Do you care to explain how the OECD developed this recommendation and guidance, and also what motivated it as well?
Yes, absolutely. And perhaps I need to rectify my previous answer, because the work of the OECD on public governance also started in the year 60s. Is of the past century, clearly. What started in the year 2000 is recognizing the centrality of digital as part of strong and solid public governance. So in that context, since about 5 years ago, as part of our work to accompany countries in becoming more capable governments, in becoming more capable to use technology, delegates started voicing out their concern about the recognition that digital identity was becoming a key enabler for them to deliver better services, but also the fact that they realized that there were many different practices around the world, that there was little clarity on how to make the most of this opportunity, balancing the risks. So we started, like, even before digital identity became such a big hot topic for everyone, we started working with governments around the world, and not only with chief information officers, but with teams tasked within governments to develop digital identity systems to understand what were the challenges they were trying to face, what were the benefits they were trying to produce with the system, and what were the different approaches they were considering. And by doing that, we started doing the analytical work of understanding pros and cons and options to address both. And that's how governments started asking us, well, what we do understand is that there's a whole set of actions that we need to put in place for the governance to be strong. Because in the absence of governance, we don't have accountability, but also we don't have the right way to engage the users, but also we don't have the right way to balance risks and opportunities. For example, how do you make sure that you manage identity and you overcome risks of identity theft, for example, while ensuring usability? So can you help us out? Getting a list of must-to-do actions that we can then utilize to take concrete, specific decisions within governments. And that's how a recommendation of the OECD, which is a soft law, meaning it's not like a directive of the European Union that needs to be transformed into a national legislation, but it's a soft law that once it's adopted by Council becomes something that has the political commitment of all governments to take actions to implement what the principles say a government should do. So it was a bottom-up way to start from the empirical analysis of what worked or what did not work over the challenges, identify together with the countries what in the wish list were the actions that had to be taken, and provide guidance for governments, but also way for governments to commit to take actions. Because as we know, governments might change. These remain a key priority issue. And if governments change, but the recommendation has been adopted by a country, then the government that comes next has the Hatama obligation to keep taking actions. And last but not least, the other request we were getting from countries was, can you help us get out of the conversation on what's the best solution? Because we do acknowledge this is not a technical conversation. So as we explore options, can you help us also be guided on what is the option that would best work in our own context?
Excellent, Barbara. Sarah, in a few minutes, we are going to see and hear and go through the UNDP governance framework with your two colleagues coming on. But can you set the stage by explaining to the audience how are these frameworks intended to be used? How is your framework going to, you're recommending that it be used? The OECD, we'll come back to that in a minute, was voted upon by the Council of Ministers, etc. So we understand. Explain to us in context, how do you think the UNDP framework should be used?
Yes, a good question. For us, it's intended as a very practical tool. You'll get a presentation on what it looks like, but it is, as you mentioned, there's a lot of overlap in terms of principles and issues and so forth with the OECD recommendations, but it is really a tool for governments, UN, civil society to be using in country to help them as they are navigating the complexities of their current situation. As Barbara says, it's really important that we're not technology driven, we're not solution driven. We are starting from an understanding that each country's situation is unique and there are specific contexts. So this is a tool that will help different people to kind of ask the right questions, align with normative frameworks, and take them forward in their journey. So that's our hope for this tool.
So do you think we can see countries using it as a self-assessment tool to identify gaps?
I don't think it's so much yes. I mean, self-assessment tends to suggest that maybe you're coming up with a score or something, you know, that you're ranked 7 out of 10 on this aspect. Right. That's not the aim. It is an analytical, it is a sort of, yes, helping as a gap assessment is a good way to put it, rather than a sense of measuring necessarily.
Well, I mean, this is an issue that comes up again and again when the political leadership talks to the civil servant community and basically keeps saying, how do I know you're doing it right? How do I know we're consistent with normative standards, etc.? So a question for both of you. How do you know that the governance in a country is performing well? And how do you create monitoring of that? If I'm in a senior level in the president's office, the prime minister's office, they want to be informed. What tools are there to assess, to say we're doing it well or there are gaps? And how do we monitor governance as the government itself? And maybe we can start with Barbara this time.
Thank you. Yeah, so in our view, the recommendation on digital identity includes the priority actions that should be taken by any government to make sure the system developed is user-driven, the right governance is in place, and the cross-border interoperability becomes a potential reality. So in that sense, being this a set of priority actions, our goal now is to develop a monitoring tool that would help governments, first of all, take actions to implement the principles, and then second, to assess the progress in implementing these principles. So for us, if we think about the recommendation as a set of guiding principles, then the work we'll be doing now, always with this bottom-up approach, will be to say, okay, if we need to translate these high-level principles into concrete actions, how do they look like? And what kind of monitoring mechanism we can develop together with this concrete guidance to foster the implementation, but to also monitor the progress. So that's going to be the core part of our work right now, to be done with the whole ecosystem of actors, not only with governments.
Okay. Sarah, do you want to take that question as well while we bring into the stage Nanjira? Operator, please
sure.
bring. Nanjira?
Yeah, so I think at a sort of more conceptual level, if you go back to how do we know when governance is working, it's when the needs and the interests of authorities and the people are both being met and the competing needs are being balanced and issues are being resolved. So, you know, this governance framework is designed to describe the different elements that need to be in place to maintain the equilibrium, and then maybe a tension between the needs of the authorities to have visibility of people and people's need for individual privacy and protection. So it's working well when that tension is being managed well, when the mechanisms are in place. So for example, is there a successful mechanism for resolution of grievances around these issues? For me, that would be a kind of practical litmus test. But there wouldn't, in my mind and from our perspective, be one kind of monitoring framework, which is one size fits all for everywhere. That you need to be looking at the principles or in a given context and then working out how that is manifest in that society and how you can make progress on that.
Yeah, we'll come back to that point. Let me welcome again Nanjira. Nanjira, please introduce yourself, explain how you have been implicated in the global technology governance dialogue, and then we can talk about the nuances of, I know you have a different view on governance, which is very interesting, we'd like to hear. So first, just tell us who you are for those who don't know, and how you've been involved in the global technology governance debate.
Sure. Good afternoon, everyone. Greetings from Nairobi, Kenya, where I am dialing in from and based. I have been involved in this conversation around technology governance, both from the local context in Kenya and what we call the global. So how do you go from local to global for the better part of the last decade, notably through the UN Secretary General's high-level panel on digital cooperation, where and a lot of my work since then has focused on how do we bring in the perspectives, especially from the global south, or the majority world as it's called, in the framing conversations and issue frames around technology and governance on the global stage. And most importantly, I have been at the sort of front lines of experiencing how, whether it's frameworks, whether it's actual introductions of these IDs, is impacting our societies.
Okay, wonderful. So you're no stranger to technology, you're no stranger to digital identity, and certainly to governance. Can you elaborate on your perspective of what do you think governance should be about?
Right. I think Barbara and Sarah have done a good job of showing that, for one, we need to be clear around the fact that governance goes beyond governments. What governments bring to the governance framework is a formal authority through legal frameworks, regulation, and other instruments, ideally through a democratic process where these perspectives that are drawn in governance and in sort of like our civic space are incorporated in shaping the eventual frameworks. And that's really important to hold in space, because too much assumption goes into putting frameworks forward, whether it's on ID, whether it's on digital identities, or just broader digital issues, assuming that, you know, governance is this neatly ordered, all things equal kind of dynamic. And we have to be very mindful of the fact that governance is inherently political. So how are political dynamics being figured or being hidden in how we talk about governance and governance frameworks, and especially where they have a local context and all the way to the international. All too often, we sort of tuck that away, whether it's in the technology realm or in the governance realm. And then when there are adverse effects is when we sort of talk about them as an afterthought or as an intended consequences kind of framing. I think we're sitting in a world today, October 18th, 2023, where it's very clear that governance is not a neat process. The world, as the UN Secretary General said at the General Assembly, is unhinged. And so these frameworks that we're putting together that read well, how do they translate in practice, should be animating the conversations we're having. Whether it's on the technological side again, or whether it's on the sort of traditional governance sense, these two things need to be interrogated in a more from the political reality lens of different communities being impacted.
Nanjira, in a way, we are entering the digitalization era, building on long history of inequities and building a long history of injustice and maybe fragilities that have existed. And how do we address this instead of building a layer on top of it? How do we make sure that governance takes into account the historical context from where we come?
That's a great question. And this will vary, I believe, from country to country and context to context. If I broadly sort of categorize what my inputs around how these developments are taking place in the developing world, all too often when you follow the thread, whether it's of the discourse or of the resourcing, you find that the perspective of those who are supposed to be benefiting comes in as an afterthought. That has remained a trend. Now, we also have to ask ourselves questions like, if there are gaping digital divides between who's already connected through digital devices, who's already connected to the governance system of a country or a context, and then we're trying to combine the two to say that's the future of service, that's the future of access, that's the future of being seen, being counted. What are we assuming and what are our assumptions and who are we assuming fills those gaps? I think those are the levels around which governance conversations on identity and everything else that is, now that we're talking about digital public infrastructure, how all of that is going to be stacked. Because all too often these divides are nuanced, they're complicated in many parts of the world, even in the Western world, you find that the connectivity in urban areas will be higher than in rural areas. And so if we introduce technologies that are designed to see those who are already visible in the digital realm, what does that mean for those who are not? And then in the sort of developed world dynamic, we tend to see this notion of developing different sets of technologies for the pro-poor, which means we tend to have different sets of rules for who is being connected to the overall thing. We all want to be identified, we want to identify everyone, but how all of us in this webinar will be identified versus how people in rural communities will be identified sometimes tends to be different because we're introducing what we call pro-poor technologies that do not affect the rest of us, but have different sets of rules. These are the underseen aspects and the soft underbellies of these governance frameworks that we need to sort of rework our understanding and our assumptions on the frameworks. And they're great frameworks, by the way, to say what happens when that's the reality. And in truth, it is the reality. So how do we sort of future-proof that to make sure we're not also creating new divides, even as we build and compound around them, because inequalities have existed since, the dawn of time.
Exactly. Now, just one last thing from you, Nanjira. You have, if I gave you 3 stakeholder groups, development agencies, government, and CSOs, mm-hmm. what advice would you give them when you look going forward? What do you think each group should try to do to make sure that this multi-stakeholder activity is a success?
Right. Let's go quickly through each group. Right. Governments need to learn to listen. And I mean this in a very humble way, in the sense that we are having a lot of governance by tick box measures where you want to introduce a new digital ID system and you put an advertisement in the print newspaper that you want public consultation reactions by next week. And then, go rinse and repeat and then say, we had 5 inputs where how you show that they were incorporated is secondary to the fact that you're able to tick that box. We need to go past that because what is being squandered here is trust and buy-in into these systems that are supposed to serve us all. And that is something we cannot afford to keep squandering, especially in these times. So that's going to be very important on how governments learn to listen and listen to their people, that bottom-up language that has been sort of permeating this conversation. I think when it comes to civil society, I love to say that they're doing the best they can with the resources that are available. Both governments and development actors need to realize that this is the group that helps organize the body politic and to really cover some of the bases that are not typically covered in the scope of what development actors and governments do. They absolutely need more support. And I know we'll hear a lot more from Paradigm Initiative, Access Now, and others who are in this conversation. And very much so listening to the critical voice that they have every right to bring to all these frameworks and these perspectives we have about the futures we envision for digital, because those are the ones that help us understand how to mitigate exacerbating inequalities or actually harms. And making that sort of like a viable rules of the road. It's part of the collateral damage in digitizing or something like that. And the third group, I think development actors, it's going to be, it remains, I think 50 years so far of sort of development or overseas development assistance existing as sort of in an industry. Again, as just as governments learning to listen to the local context, there's this obsession both in development sector and also in the tech companies space where scale tends to be thought of as, if it has worked in one context, it will surely work in the other. I mean, they're all developing countries, right? But we have to have new frames that understand you have to see every context for the intractability there. We are humans, we are complex in our ordered societies. We need to rethink scale as what is appropriate and sustainable in every context that we are serving, and how do we build layers that help those systems be interoperable. And the resourcing, the financing that will go into that, the 360 view in that regard will absolutely help, and especially in developing countries, to actually help cover the basis of all the things that are being assumed as given in this dual pathway of governance and strengthening our governance systems, and introducing digital to govern and also to govern with them. So these are things that really, really need to be taken very seriously, and not just as a sort of like the cool, controversial points that you add to a panel discussion.
Okay. Thank you, Nanjira, for that insight and that passion. So we'll definitely continue that dialogue in other contexts, and hopefully maybe at the AGM. I want to close this part of the segment by asking both Sarah and Barbara, what now? What happens next? I mean, we have reached a point where there is some semblance of consensus around digital identity governance frameworks. What would you like to see happen next?
Shall I go first? I mean, I would like to see, I agree with you. I think the field's made enormous progress. I think recent sort of definitions around inclusive digital public infrastructure and the need for safeguards and so forth are really important, have been really important. And I think we've reached a point this summer, actually, with some of the discussions around the SDG Summit and the UN General Assembly and so on, where we have a measure of consensus on these issues. Right. So one aspect is the development, more practical, the development of these frameworks and these tools and these support for capacities in country to be using them and to be rolling them out. But then the other side is actually what Nanjira has just been talking about. And I agreed with every word, I think, of what she said. It is so important that there is multi-stakeholder participation. That's the UN jargon. But that the people who are affected by these developing frameworks are fully engaged in their development and their rollout, whether that's at the global level, regional levels, country levels, subnational levels. We really need to see much better and broader participation in these issues, which are fundamentally changing our lives and fundamentally changing how governance systems are operating. So one, there's a kind of more practical, still difficult, rollout and support and all of that aspects. But there, I think we need to see a shift in our understanding of who is developing these frameworks and the legitimacy they have and the need to involve people, more people from more places in that discussion.
Thank you, Sarah. Barbara, do you want to close us on this topic?
Yes, thank you so much. Very much echoing what Sarah said. On one side, I think the real work starts now. We have a framework, we have a recommendation. So I think that internationally, nationally, and locally, we need to make something out of it and do it together. So the real practical work begins. But second, I've been working on this for the past 23 years. I was at the UN before joining the OECD. And what I really think it's very important for us to do right now is really to connect the dots. Digital identity, digital government, artificial intelligence, inclusive services, these all need to be agendas that need to be connected with each other. Otherwise, we will miss out the opportunity. And to remember that, context matters. So I think connecting the agendas and connecting experiences will make it possible to take the concrete actions that deliver the results, because otherwise we will just have very nice instruments that we will not transform into concrete results for the people.
Excellent. We are committed to actually having a governance discussion with multi-stakeholders involved at the AGM next year. Hopefully we'll see all of you and as well as others participating in that event. We ran out of time for this part. It was really an interesting conversation for me. I hope everybody found it as fascinating as I did. So I want to thank you, all three of you, once again for being with us, and to say until the next time we meet again, please be safe, be well. We're now ready to move to part 2, which will be a presentation of the UNDP governance framework. To explain the framework in detail, we have with us Risa Arai and Dr. Emrys Schoemaker, who are now being brought to the screen. Actually, perhaps before we get to the presentation, maybe we can bring the two panelists to the screen, Risa and Emrys. Operator, bring our guests. Yes. Thank you once again, both of you, for being with us. I want to hand over to you the podium and the stage, and I understand you are going to walk us through the details of the framework, including how it should be used and how you developed it in a consultative manner, how you arrived where you are today. You have 20 minutes to bring all of that together. So I'll get off the screen and I'll leave you to drive this. So Risa, the stage is yours.
Thank you so much, Joseph. Let me share my presentation. But I would like to first start saying thank you to ID for Africa colleagues and an audience for being here today and hosting us for the webinar. We are proudly launching this ID framework, which is like UNDP work, but it was done in partnership with the prominent experts in the world, like Bronwyn Mambi, Sartak Sapati, and Emrys over here, as well as the other CSO colleagues and experts in this field all over the world. So we're really proud that this is a kind of accumulation of knowledge on governance and digital ID, and I'm happy to present it to you today. Today, I would like to start with what kind of challenges that we are trying to address using this framework, and I will hand over to Emrys for the deep dive of how the framework works. So let me start here. UNDP, recently we have been receiving a lot of requests, probably also because of the impact of the COVID, as well as the recent G20 declaration on the DPI. We are receiving a lot of requests from the member states to digitalize their legal identity ecosystem. And we are aware that this brings a lot of social and economic benefits, but also this digital ID will a great contributor to close the global identity gap. So that is the whole request and the surge of the needs coming out from the member states. But we are also aware that in order to have a robust digital identity system, governance aspect is critical. And we need to establish digital ID in a manner to generate trust from the citizens and make sure that human rights are at the center of its design and implementation and operation. So that's why we started to developing this framework. And when we are going to when we want to make sure that digital ID is inclusive, people-centered, and then contributes to the inclusive growth and sustainable human development, there are a lot of issues that we need to consider. So, for example, if there's a data protection and privacy law in place to protect our data, is there a procurement guidelines to prevent vendor lock-in and then to ensure sustainable in terms of financially and human resource capacity, maintaining the digital ID system, whether there is a mechanism to monitor and evaluate the how digital ID is being implemented, if there is a complaint, there are proper mechanisms to address that, etc. So there are it's not just about national ID law or CRBS law, but this requires a whole of government and whole of society approach to ensure that there's a proper framework in place to have human rights at the center. But right now we also see a lot of inadequate governance mechanism of digital ID. So there were a bunch of court cases where some of the ID schemes got derailed because court find it unconstitutional to keep biometrics data for indefinite period of time. Or even though court cases forbid the private and public services to make it mandatory to have digital ID to access to services, there are not much of the monitoring and evaluation practices, so that this practice of requiring ID continues, which leads to which leads to not being able to access to such services by citizens. And also, for example, when the citizens wants to complain about those issues, they find it very difficult because sometimes ID is managed by the security sector. So those complex issues we need to address to have the right digital ID system. So this is the challenge that we are trying to solve using our digital governance framework. And this is where you can access to our framework. I see also ID for Africa colleagues put their URL in the chat box, but we developed this in order to address those challenges, complex challenges, in a comprehensive manner. And we aim at the government, CSOs, donors, and UN colleagues to use this framework to ensure that ongoing programming on the digital ID is human rights centered and inclusive. So that's the whole purpose of our framework. And then before I hand over to Emrys, I just want to quickly guide you how we envisage that users can make use of our framework. So when you look at the framework together with Emrys, you will see a lot of questions that you can, which gets asked about your digital ID system. And then you will answer to those questions. And then by doing so, you can identify challenges and opportunities that your system has for further improvement. So any users who want to use our framework, they can start with study the framework and then also identify what's the purpose of your ID system so that you can customize either, you kind of pick the important parts of the framework and use in a tailored manner, or you can also use it comprehensively of our framework. And then after those desk review and interviews, by answering that series of the questions, you can identify challenges and opportunities to improve your governance system. And then we expect that it can be validated throughout the workshop with the government, and then, you know, have a series of recommendations, and that can, you know, go to the next stage to implement those recommendations. So that's how we emphasize that this framework is being used by different stakeholders. With that, I'd like to hand over to Emrys so that he can show how the framework looks like and then guide you how to use it in a more detailed manner. So over to you, Emrys.
Thank you, Risa, and good morning, good afternoon, good evening to nearly 300 people who've joined this call, which I think is an incredible testament to the recognized importance that digital identity systems as part of widespread digital transformation is taking place. We know this stuff is important, and clearly so many people do. And just as a sidebar, I think it's also a testament to the incredible convening power of the ID for Africa community and the incredible production values that the team is able to pull together. So thank you for both having us and creating the space for us to share this, and also for pulling together such an incredible platform. I want to say just one thing quickly before I jump into a description of the framework in detail, which is a little bit about the context that this comes from. The model governance framework is part of UNDP's legal identity work, but it's also part of UNDP's work around digital public infrastructure. And in both the work around legal identity and digital identity and in digital public infrastructure, this framework reflects a recognition that there has been a huge amount of work done to develop and advance the technology side of these systems and of the core digital systems that are part of digital transformation. But that the technology systems, as Nanjira, as Sarah, and Barbara have mentioned, are not the only parts of digital transformation. And certainly we need to recognize that there's a wider context in which they sit. UNDP's commitment to a whole of society approach to digital transformation is central to how digital public infrastructure is understood and how the governance approach of UNDP is framed as well. So this framework is a critical part of recognizing that digital public infrastructure and digital identity sits within a much wider ecosystem of how these processes of digital transformation take place. And that reflects a really important theme, which is firstly this whole of society approach, and secondly that while there has been huge progress in understanding how digital identity systems can support generating value and supporting development outcomes, there's only now beginning to be a recognition of the degree to which there needs to be an engagement with protecting the downsides, the risks that these technology systems introduce. And UNDP and the UN Tech Envoy recently announced a safeguarding initiative, which reflects this commitment to really trying to ensure that digital transformation is not just delivering value and progress, but also supporting, protecting, and maintaining rights. So it's just important to say that this framework is part of this wider commitment to really trying to ensure that the governance dimensions of technology are front and central to advancing inclusion, protection, and rights. The other thing, and this is part of the digital public infrastructure or digital public goods approach, this framework isn't fixed. And Nanjira and Sarah really made the point that, these processes of development need to be informed, not from a bottom up, that's a really crude way of putting a hierarchy, but informed by the voices of people who are not always heard. And so this framework is understood as a digital public good. It's going to be hosted on an open source platform. It's going to be open for input. We expect it to be used in different ways to meet the distinct and unique demands of particular context. And as such, like open source software, will have different variants. It'll have forks as it's applied in different contexts. So this framework is something that we see as being a living document. It's evolving. As you'll see when I share my screen shortly, it's a beta version. So this is something that's growing and will be reflecting the inputs of people who have different insights and expertise. Got very limited time, so I'm going to jump into a detailed run through of what the framework looks like. As you can see on the screen, we have a wheel on the right. This reflects the 8 core themes or categories that the governance framework covers. And it's important to say from the beginning that the governance framework is as complex as a whole of society approach might suggest. In fact, when we were developing the framework, we almost threw our hands up in despair at thinking about how to bring it together in a way that made sense. Fortunately, colleagues who are far brighter and far more far better at communicating complexity than I am, helped the team pull together the detailed number of elements that we recognize as being important into this really accessible framework. So there's 8 core themes that reflect the elements of the framework. Each of those 8 themes has a description of what those themes are. The website has it breaks down those themes into the sub-elements that constitute that headline category. There are anchor questions to help use the framework in a way that can support assessment or support strategy development or an understanding of context, as well as the implications of what each of those elements are for maintaining rights. And that's really important to see that anchoring and the implication of rights. And finally, it has a description of what some of the example scenarios for what the arrangement of these different elements might be. These are not prescriptive. They're far from ideal or model ones. We recognize that each context and each situation is unique, but these are simply descriptions of what might be worked towards as an example of what a particular focus might be. I realize that as I'm describing all of this, it sounds very abstract. Let me try and make this a little bit more concrete by running through the actual framework as you can see it online when you log on. And if I can just get access to the screen sharing, I can bring that up. I hope you can all see that. What you should be able to see on the screen is this framework. This describes the governance framework. And as we go down, you'll see there's a description of what it is. There's that, what we call a governance wheel, the 8 elements that make up the framework. And just to run through what those 8 elements are, there's equality and non-discrimination, accountability and the rule of law, legal and regulatory framework, capable institutions, data protection and privacy, user value, procurement and anti-corruption, and participation and access to information. Each of those core elements has a description of what that element is. And then, for example, if we click on capable institutions as the example, you can see that there's 2 sub-elements here that describe what it is. It's institutional arrangements for management of an ID ecosystem, effective coordination and collaboration. Now, in order to operationalize that, if you want to use this to look at what is the current state of an ecosystem in a particular context, we explore the framework further. And it describes what these elements are. And to go through the elements that I described earlier, you can see on the left, there are the sub-element details. So, for example, the relationship between different ministries and agencies in charge of legal identity. There's other elements such as the independency of the agency managing identification. Critically, of course, resourcing and capacity budget, the management of identification, staff qualifications and capacity. Then there's the anchor questions. If you're going to run through and using this as an assessment, these are the questions that you might ask in order to understand what a particular context looks like. So, for example, are the responsibilities and authority of the different ministries or departments that are ultimately responsible for the management of digital legal ID clearly established in law? Is the relationship between different entities clear? And so on. For each of the sub-elements, there's an anchor question. Then there's an explanation of what the rights implications are of these different elements to understand how each of the elements of the framework plays a critical role in supporting and maintaining rights. And then we have a description of what an example scenario of these different elements could look like. And again, as just to be clear, we're not making prescriptive recommendations. This would be against the principle of partnership and collaboration that the framework reflects, but really just a description of what might be a destination to aim towards. And importantly also to say, these are not elements or components of the framework that we just picked out of the air and thought these sounded nice, although I think they do. But these elements are rooted in and build upon existing best practice, existing frameworks, existing policy and regulations. So for example, you can see here, there's work from UNDESA, from the Department of Economic and Social Affairs within the UN. There's also builds on work from the World Bank's Identification for Development Program, such as the Principles for Identification for Sustainable Development. This work is intended to be a complement to that, to support and advance work already being done, but to add a particular contribution that, as has been said throughout, reflects UNDP's whole of society approach, the governance commitment that reflects a really broad holistic understanding, and also that it really is committed to maintaining and supporting rights and the achievement of them. I can go through one more, I think, example, and then we can open it up to the next stage and question. But again, so for example, one of the other 8 elements is participation and access to information. If we click here, we can see what the other sub-elements are. Resources and transparency in public participation, resources and accountability for public participation, legislative oversight. And again, we might go through the anchor questions. Let's say, for example, legislative oversight. Have the elements of digital identification system been examined by relevant committees, and so on? Is there strong legislative oversight and what that means for rights? And then what the model or the ideal outcome might be, or an example outcome. And again, the routing and where that exists in existing best practice. And you can see, for example, the ID4D practitioner's guide there. You can see UNDP's civil society engagement guidebook, many resources, many resources that have gone into this. And again, a shout out to Sartak and Bronwyn, who've been critical in helping us really pull this together. I want to say 2 things quickly about how this is used. Risa's already mentioned those 3 steps, but importantly, and this also goes to Sarah's point, this can help identify gaps. It can help give a snapshot of what a governance situation might be in a particular context. This is not intended to be judgmental, and it's not intended to be prescriptive. So it's intended as a resource for people who perhaps want to just map out what a current situation is, but also can support the development of strategy. It can help through that mapping, provide a baseline, identify areas that might be felt could be improved upon, could be strengthened, and that can provide the basis for all actors who may wish to further advance the role of safe and inclusive and rights-maintaining digital identity systems. In critically also, and I'll say this just as a final point, if you go up to the front of the framework, we're particularly excited about this because this framework is intended to be inclusive for all. So we have an AI-powered chatbot, which allows us to ask any question related to the framework. I did ask what the meaning of life was, and it came back with 42, which is an answer that others have given in the past, of course, as well. I'm being a little bit facetious. The point being, this framework is intended to be accessible, and you can ask questions in ways that it will give answers related to the framework without you having to comb through all of the documentation that it has within it. I'll stop there on that exciting note and hand back to Risa and Joseph for questions in the next segments. Thank you so much for the opportunity.
Thank you, Emrys. I love very much the AI interface. It allows you to interrogate this body of knowledge. And was it trained also on the other documents that you reference in the framework?
It's a great question, Joseph. The training of the LLM that this is based on is, of course, entirely proprietary and very, very closed and secret. I'm joking. It was trained primarily on the framework itself, but the framework is, of course, built on all of that documentation. Some of the external documents that were used to train it are not as accessible. But if you look in the chat, my colleague Ben, who really drove the advance and inclusion of the chatbot in it, has posted a link to a description of how we trained the chatbot, which gives a full rundown of all of the material that went into it.
Actually, not to put you on the spot, but on November 15, we are bringing together how AI is impacting the development agenda. If you want to, for 10 minutes, bring somebody to explain how the chat bot was trained to delve into the UNDP framework, we would love to hear that in more detail, because we don't have the time here. But Risa, please consider bringing the right person, maybe your colleague.
Yeah, sure. So we train about 80 documents using for this AI chatbots, but I just want to tell you, because this is only trained for this particular framework, if you ask for something else, they won't answer.
No, but that's actually good. It's very, very specific to the framework. I want to close with just a quick question. There are a few questions that came online, so please afterwards answer them if you may. But I wanted to ask you, and this is something that I get asked a lot by, and when early days when I was working with the World Bank, we developed assessment frameworks. And the question came back, not all factors are created equal. And so there are certain things whose absence would have much bigger impact than others. So in going through the framework, I noticed that the 8 pillars were presented democratically, equally important. Is there any view in the future of building some sort of an understanding of hierarchy and measure of impact?
Risa's better placed to respond to that as a corporate and deeply understanding of UNDP's plans here. But I think one thing from my perspective, supporting the development of the framework, is that I think we did want it to be democratic. We didn't want to make judgments about which elements were going to be most significant, because contexts differ. And as we've heard so clearly from Nanjira, from Sarah, from Bob, from others, and we know this from the consultative process that we went through in the development of the framework, this needs to be able to respond to that diversity. But as I also said, the hope would be, the aspiration is that this framework will be the basis for further tools and applications. And so it would be fantastic to see how, in one context, perhaps certain elements are prioritized and seen as being more significant, and that could bring in a weighting element to the framework. But I defer to Risa on the next steps for that.
Thank you so much, Emrys. So we do not right now have a plan to make it hierarchy, but as Emrys said, this framework is kind of the DPG, so it will be posted on the GitHub, and then everyone, like literally everyone in the world, can comment on it. And then for now, the plan is in 6 months' time we will review it again, and then from the next year on, it will be like a year review process will happen. But if there's this like strong demand of it, we can definitely consider. So we are going to put this link hopefully towards the end of the month. So when the link is there, we strongly encourage everyone to comment, to provide your feedback how this framework can be better. So that's our next step.
Excellent. Okay, wonderful. I really love this framework, and I hope that everybody will join as a community in its continued development and using it to make our discussions more mature and structured. So thank you so much for this. We ran out of time. We're going to continue with segment 1, part 3. And so I'll ask the operator to prepare the 2 other panelists while we say goodbye to Risa and Emrys. Thank you very much. Let us move on and sort of bring in the representatives, 2 representatives from the CSO community, the civil society. And we'll have with us Marianne, Díaz, Hernández from Access Now, and Adeboye, Adegoke from Paradigm Initiative. Operator, yes, we have them. Okay. Hello, Marianne. Hello, Adeboye. Thank you both for being with us. I want to give you, as a representative of civil society, the opportunity to comment and give a perspective beyond governance, beyond any of the specifics that you've heard. What I would like to start first and foremost, for those who do not know your organizations, maybe you can introduce your organization and explain how has your organization been involved with digital identity and identification. So let's start with you, Marianne, if you don't mind.
Absolutely. Thank you, Joseph, for the opportunity. As you mentioned earlier, I work with the YID campaign at Access Now. Access Now is a civil society organization that works globally and has been working globally for the past 14 years on defending and extending the digital rights of users and communities at risk. And the YID campaign specifically is a campaign that aims to work with civil society, the tech community, but also international organizations, development organizations, and companies to interrogate digital ID systems in order to make them better at accomplishing human rights. That's basically our job, and we have been doing it for the past 5 years or so.
Okay, excellent. Adeboye?
Yeah, good afternoon, everyone. Depending on which part of the world you are listening from, Adeboye Adegoke. I work as Senior Manager, Program Strategy and Grants at Paradigm Initiative. Paradigm Initiative is a non-profit organization that works in Africa to promote digital inclusion and digital rights. And we've been in digital ID work for more than 10 years now, because our involvement in digital ID work was informed by the introduction of digital ID systems in Nigeria at the time, and the concerns that we had because of the legal and regulatory frameworks at the time. It's a pleasure to be part of this conversation today and to share our perspective on the subject.
Okay, great. So Marianne, going back to you, what is it about digital identity that really causes you concern? And of course, this is not a topic we can cover in 20 minutes. It's a vast topic. So we're going to try to focus on some of the primary concerns to try to make sure that our community is sensitive and aware. And then we could try to address how we try to deal with those concerns. So digital identity, why does it cause so much concern to CSOs?
Well, there are 2 levels to that answer. So the first layer, and that I'm sure that everyone here is aware of, we have been having many conversations across the years that are like discrimination, privacy, the potential for surveillance, all of that. But I would like to bring it one step up from there, because this is also a conversation that we have been having with the UN, with UNDP, with the World Bank as well, and many other actors in the space, which is the framing, and this is the framing in the ecosystem and in general, right? And not necessarily in any specific actors of the ones that we are talking here today. The framing on technology as a goal and not necessarily as a tool. So we think that digitalization should be a tool, and the goal is the accomplishment of legal identity as a human right, and I think that we agree on that. But as we frame that in the opposite order, then technology becomes a primary answer. So there is a conflation between the concepts of digital identity and legal identity, which are not the same. And digital identity can be, of course, a tool to accomplishing legal identity for all, but not necessarily in all cases. So we think that it is important to interrogate the context and to interrogate technology as well in the specific implementation, which I think that we are all doing in our own ways. And in that regard, we are currently very concerned about the framing of digital identity and digital legal identity, not as the right of the individual, but as a right of the state. So when states want to have every citizen identified at every moment in time, this leads to a potential surveillance state. And as we know, legal identity for all is a human right, and therefore it's a right of the person. And the person, that means that we also have a right to anonymity in certain circumstances. I think that several of the frameworks that we are talking about today approach this in different ways, and this is a conversation that is ongoing with regards of layers of how to be identified and to what degree to be identified in each specific context. But I do think that there is a need to take that step back and remember that we are talking about a human right, the human right of the person to be identified, to have that specific relationship acknowledged within a state, and a more extensive treatment of the rights that we are invoking here, which is that we have been talking for many years about privacy and data protection, and also about access to particular services, but also as identity is a very core right of the individual, we should be talking as well about autonomy, dignity, bodily integrity, self-ownership, and self-determination in the context of technology as well. And these are all ongoing conversations, but these are current concerns for the civil society groups I work with.
Adeboye, let's take this question and contextualize it a little bit more in Africa. Are the concerns in the African context more severe, or are they the same as anywhere else in the world?
Absolutely. Just to say that I agree with the point that has been made by Marianne, and I think there is, from a civil society perspective, there are consensus around those basic issues. But also in terms of contextualizing to Africa, but also in terms of also being practical in terms of where we are in the digital identity drive. Because when we got involved in the work, at that time, Africa had less than probably 20% even internet penetration, but now we're not at that point. A lot of countries now have a data protection law. A lot of countries have implemented digital ID systems, and so those realities are a bit different. But I think our issues as Africans are a bit different because our contexts are also different. They are different in terms of how our level of adoption of technology in the first place. It's not really the case that there has been massive adoption of technology across Africa. For example, I'm currently participating in a workshop for the judiciary in Nigeria, and while we're going through the registration process, I saw that a lot of these senior judges they still use Gmail addresses, they still use Yahoo addresses, and so you can see some fundamental issues across into even digital literacy or digital hygiene that are still very problematic even amongst people that you think would know better. So there's those basic issues that are very, very significant for us. So even as we have found ourselves in a situation whereby digital ID has become a part of our reality, because when we started this work, we started from a place of we don't even want this to happen at all. But that is not where we are right now. Where we are right now, this is already happening. It is already part of our reality. In fact, in some cases, this is already mandatory for the ability of citizens to even access some basic services. So the conversation we are having right now is that how do we, in this regime, how do we ensure some level of sanity for our people of our country, and in terms of now that we have this in place, and that's why I was interested in the conversation, because it's talking about governance. Is there a way we can use governance to correct some of the issues that we have identified? Is there a way we can use governance to make a sense of everything that is happening? Because in Africa, I already mentioned the issue of adoption of digital technology. I mentioned the issue of digital literacy, but I think one thing that is also very contextual for Africa is what I also think is the issue of effective governance system, not just in terms of digital ID, even in terms of traditional governance. There is a lot of gaps in terms of efficiency of governance system. So even before we got to conversation around digital IDs, it has been a strong topical issues within the continent into how we are governing technology generally. So having digital ID in the mix then also raises that concern to the extent that all the issues that have been identified by civil society organizations, issues around discrimination, privacy, surveillance, etc. How are those issues, are they going to be managed? Are they going to be addressed? Are they going to be intimidated? Especially when you are not confident in the governance system or the governance ability in terms of the efficiency of the governance ability. I think it was Nanjira who made the point earlier about the importance of trust, in terms of governance of digital ID systems. Some of the challenges we've had within African context is that people don't even trust the government adoption of this system. A lot of people think that this is just an attempt by government to increase its ability power, the power to practice surveillance on the people. I recall that a few years ago, we were working with the National Identity Management Commission in Nigeria to kind of create a platform of engagement between the Identity Commission and the people, because the Identity Commission was doing its work trying to get as many people as possible into the digital ID system. But then there is a group of citizens who don't even understand what is going on. So we emphasize a lot on awareness creation in terms of helping people to understand what all of this is about, and also listening to the people, their concerns, the reservations and all of that. So trust is big in the context as well. In the African context, trust is a very great issue, it's a very great denominator in terms of how people accept or reject digital ID governance system. Thank you very much, Joseph.
Thank you, Adeboye, for this statement. And Marianne, when we look at the current situation that we are in today and what's contributing to the current tension between the various stakeholders, and which in some cases has led to adversarial dialogue instead of collaboration, there are many elements that we can see. And one of them is, does civil society feel they have not been given enough place at the table to have an honest discussion? I mean, how do you feel the role, the recognition of the role of civil society in this transformative tool of society?
Well, I don't know if it's exactly how I personally feel, but I work with over 100 organizations that work in digital ID and digital identity, which are different things from civil society. And I think that our main concern here, that we all take different approaches to, of course, because we are different people, is about the dichotomy between participatory decision-making and collaborative decision-making. So we're having so far mostly consultative models, which means that there is a process and we get consulted at the end of it for feedback, and that restricts our ability to actually provide the wealth of knowledge that we have from working with the communities directly day in and day out. So yeah, I feel that our ability to engage, that in some places we have seen like very reasonable improvement to that dialogue, and to our ability to engage in iterative processes like the one that UNDP is doing with their framework right now. But I do feel that our inability to engage productively in early stages, but also in a way that we feel that our contributions are actually being taken into account, and not only like checking the box of consulting with CSO, has led many actors in the community to feeling frustrated, and frustration is not conducive to productive dialogue. I personally, as part of again, this very vibrant community, I feel that we are in a better place now to better engage, because I believe that at some point there is a good overlap between the things that we all want, and that allowing for a space to understand the role that each stakeholder has, which is different. Like the role of civil society is very specific, and it is pushing back against certain things. That is the role, that is the work. And allowing that space is going to be more conducive to better dialogue in the future.
Interesting point, Marianne. Maybe, Adeboye, you can sort of drive towards what do you think is the ideal role that civil society should be allowed to play? And it's not just in an asymmetrical fashion where the government is taking a posture and only consulting with you after the fact. So talk to us about what is the ideal role in Africa that civil society should play, and what do you advise governments in terms of facilitating that role?
All right, thank you very much. I think this is a very important question, and I love that this is coming up because even if you had not asked, I was going to kind of emphasize, to kind of amplify that point that was made by Marianne. Now, this is the issue. As civil society actors, the roles that we are meant to play isn't exactly the same as the role with other stakeholders. And I think that point is very important because I get, for example, I get invited a lot of time by the Identity Commission, asking if we would love to be involved in the process of enrollment. We would like to get enrollment contracts. Sometimes I find it insulting because we don't do the work that we do so that we can become one of the vendors for the work that the Identity Commission is doing. We do the work we do because we believe that it is important for civil society organizations to be involved even in some of the design, of the process in its entirety. It is important because civil society, play an important role within the ecosystem, an important role in terms of being the closest to the ordinary people, being more familiar with the actual needs of an average citizen, and also be in tune with what is possible from the other side of the divide. We always say that a cutlass or a knife can serve two purposes. Civil society is more familiar with what the other side of the, the other side of the knife can be used for. So there are so many issues around security, around discrimination that civil society are so very familiar with, and which we are trying to bring into the conversation. So that's what we want. That's the kind of role we want to play, highlighting these issues, mitigating these issues, recommending how these issues can be mitigated to the barest minimum, and ensuring that the governance model as well is designed in a way that those issues are factored in those governance models. So I think it's also very important. So in case there are people, listening to this call who work on the side of the government, I think it is disrespectful when civil society are making some of those points and then they are offered contract as though they are just asking to be given a part of the pie. That is not what the point is about. The point is about getting involved actually in the design, also in the accountability processes. So there are also need for accountability. There are needs for human rights impact assessment. This is where civil society can come in. They can be invited for to carry out human rights impact assessment. They can be invited to sit at the table when governance models are being designed, not to come and validate what has been designed without their input. So I think these are helpful. Yeah.
Excellent points, Adeboye. Marianne, I want to, in any partnership, obviously, in order to get over the imbalance or in the inequity in the partnership or the asymmetry, it's important that both parties appreciate the value or the power, the negotiating power that the other side brings to the table. When you look at CSOs, and I'm asking this as a generic question, it could be in Africa, it could be in different countries around the world, what do you think the CSOs bring to the table that makes them a really important partner and a stakeholder that must be brought in from the beginning and must be worked with? I mean, give me, what are the tools of the civil society? I mean, this is not charity. Civil society is not about, yeah, well, let's pay lip service to them, because you have power. I mean, it's clear.
We absolutely do. We work in coalition, which is, I think, the main power that we have. So that means that we have partners locally, regionally, and globally that understand the context, that understand the risks, that understand the specificities of the socio-political situation in each of the countries that we work in. So that level of not only knowledge, but leverage and trust is something that cannot really be transferred, like something that it is a specific type of capital that we have because of relationships that we have been building for many years. But also I think that it cannot be overstated that how much expertise there is regarding human rights and their particularities in CSO as well as in academia that works closely with CSO, because we do research, and we of course do our own research. And I think that it is important to like understand how different it might be, the research that comes from a CSO, the research that comes from a think tank or a development agency, that it's not like undermining the value of each one of those, but understanding that they might complement each other in a way that if we take only one of those aspects into account, we are not going to get the full picture. So I think that other than the specificities of the knowledge, which is something that I don't think that anyone here takes for granted because of the conversations that we have been having, and I know that the feedback is appreciated. Also, we have been talking a lot about trust, and these systems require, and there was a question somewhere about how to implement the systems. If there isn't trust in the system is going to break like quickly. And the only way really to achieve a proper level of trust within any given community is through the relationship building process that CSO is of the actors is the one that is better positioned to achieve and understand how to work, because we work closely with communities day in and day out. And I think that you asked for 2, I think I gave you 3, but I can keep going.
I'm surprised you did not mention media. I mean, CSOs have a lot of media relations. Wouldn't you think one of your strongest tools in the recent past has been the media?
Well, it depends. As Adeboye was mentioning, when you have a set of tools, right, and you have 2 sides to the knife, it depends on context. It depends a lot on which type of attention and which type of response you're trying to get. Sometimes, yes, civil society organizations have, like, it depends a lot on the country, but in certain countries, I come from a dictatorship particularly, and in getting the attention of a dictatorship, you cannot come with the blunt side of the knife. Then it depends on context a lot. But knowing when to use each particular approach is very important, and we do have a lot of experience, a collective experience on that. I do think that media is, of course, a powerful ally, not only in getting attention in particular context, but also in sharing information with the community, with the broader population about certain implementations and what they mean, because these topics can be very technical. And people, depending on context as well, depending on sociopolitical context, they can be scared about these implementations. So in getting that trust, in getting to that level of negotiation and public conversation about the systems that needs to be had, because these systems cannot be implemented in the dark for the general population, I do think that media is a powerful ally.
Okay, and we are absolutely committed to making sure that this dialogue is multi-stakeholder and it's symmetrical. And so you can take this commitment from me all the way. And next year at the AGM, we want to see civil society having, from the start, a role in that dialogue and in enhancing this. The only thing is, I want to close because we're running out of time on this segment. And maybe Adeboye, you can answer that. And then Marianne, if you have anything to add to it, add. When we talk about CSOs, it's so heterogeneous. It is so they have many different issues and agendas, etc. You spoke about, Marianne spoke about coalition. And the power of the coalition is when there is coherence. So Adeboye, are we getting to a point where do you see the CSOs lining up in the terms of a coherence regarding digital identity? And what is the CSO community doing to create that coherence so there's harmony among the CSOs instead of basically one organization speaks with one voice and then others have different agendas? So talk a little bit about the harmonization of the CSOs to create a sort of a unified front or position for them to negotiate from. You're on mute.
All right, thank you very much. So the first thing I would say is that from a civil society perspective, there group of, there are coalitions, for example. Marianne spoke to the movement that that Access Now is part of, Paradigm Initiative is part of that movement. So there are those level of kind of harmonization that happen at coalition level, whereby there seems to be a level of consensus in terms of what we stand for, in terms of what we believe, in terms of what we are advocating for. And I do agree that that is also very useful in terms of being able to put forward a very strong position, and also to kind of have a respectable voice when you represent diverse voices. But I also want to say that I don't also think that absolutely it has to always be about coherence, because I also think that if a group of 10, 20, 50 organizations comes together and they agree on every single thing, then there is also a problem. It's also problematic. I think for us, we operate in a space whereby it is okay to have disagreement, but we can agree on fundamental issues. We may disagree in approaches and all of that. But in terms of how the CSO community then engage, with other stakeholders related to digital ID governance, I think basically our principles are the same. We do not have a lot of disagreement, but I also think that sometimes some of the disagreements we have seen are unfortunately been as a result of infiltration of maybe CSOs by political interests, especially at the national level, because sometimes when you don't have some sort of like you rightly said earlier, in terms of when you don't have some sort of a friendly approach to conversation, when it becomes adversarial, the political actors might devise other means to kind of divide your voices as civil society organization, just to achieve its objective and to be able to tick the box that it has carried CSO along. At least if you can get a number of CSO who kind of speak in support of what you're trying to push. And that's why I also feel it is very, as CSO organization, we also have a responsibility to be tactful, to make sure that we are able to continue to engage and sit on the table and avoid as much as possible the adversarial approach, which might then be used as a tool to also cause division within the CSO community, and also make it impossible for us to put together a very strong, position that we can all agree with, and can also help us to engage more effectively with political authority. Yeah, so this is how I see our engagement with other stakeholders when it comes to the issue at hand. Thank you.
Marianne, just to close, do you think in general the CSO community can be supportive of digital identity if it is done right?
That is a trick question, Joe. I think that the CSO can support any implementation of technology that is aimed at fulfilling human rights properly. I don't think that there will ever be a blanket support to digital ID systems as a thing, as a technology, as it should be to any technology, I think, because we're not about technology, we're about human rights. So that to me means a very important distinction between what we say when we mean digital identity and what we say when we mean digital ID, which is digital ID is a system, digital identity is the right. We support the right to a digital identity as well as we support the right to a legal identity. But the ID system, we don't believe that it necessarily has to be digital. We believe that it can be digital in certain implementations, and in certain implementations it can be better. But again, not necessarily and not in all the cases. And as long as we do have guidelines and frameworks, and particularly safeguards in place, for the systems to work in a way that fulfills and respects all human rights, I think we can very much get on the same page eventually.
Okay. Well, this is an optimistic place to end this particular segment. So I want to thank both of you. And I actually will say I'm looking forward to having both of you at the AGM in person, to continue this dialogue and expand the scope of this dialogue to our annual meeting. So please consider this as an invitation, and we look forward to seeing you with us. Thank you again very much for being with us. And I would like to move to segment 1, part 4 now. Operator, please bring our guests from the government of Kenya and Malawi. While they're coming, as you know, Kenya and Malawi, both countries have been developing digital identity, have been making significant progress at many levels, not just from a technology point of view. And here with us to talk about their journey in digital identity, the Ambassador Professor Julius Bitok, who's the PS of the organization in charge of identity in Kenya. And of course, Mr. Sambo, who is the Director General of the NRB, he's the PS Principal Secretary of the organization, again, who is responsible of identity in Malawi. Both countries have made, as I said, significant progress in this regard. Thank you both for being with us, taking time from your busy schedule to join us. I will start with Ambassador Bitok, and I will raise the question. How does your country see the necessity for digital identity? We've just heard that digital identity might be a good idea, but it's not necessarily 100% needed. How do you view digital identity in Kenya in terms of its role?
Yes. Okay, thank you very much for this opportunity. And I want to thank you for inviting me to join you and to join the UNDP panel and the CSO, the civil society organizations, in this very important live cast. I want to begin by saying that it was really a great honor and privilege to host you for ID for Africa 2023 conference. We want to thank you for accepting to have it in Kenya. And indeed, we had a very colorful also ID day on the 16th of September in Nakuru. And I saw some of the pictures which you ran there. To start off the discussion about what you have asked me, I want to say that when we see UNDP here, they are our partners here in Kenya. We are working closely with them to ensure that we deliver a digital ID for the people of Kenya. So we are working very closely. We have a memorandum of understanding, an MOU with UNDP. So when they were making their presentations, we could actually see the work we are doing together with them and the progress so far we have made. Now, to come back to your question very briefly, I want to say that Kenya is on the road towards digital ID. And for us as a country, it's a very critical endeavor. Kenya feels that it is time to move with the rest of the world towards a digital identity. And we are doing everything possible to ensure that we deliver a digital identity for the people of Kenya before the end of this year. And in our solution, we have proposed four components of the digital ID. The first component is what we are calling unique personal identifier, a unique number for every child born in Kenya. And we are calling that Maisha number. The second component is a smart card, what we are calling a digital card with a chip. And it's an upgrade of the second generation to third generation ID. We are calling it a Maisha card, a card which can be utilized in whatever places. It is the only card you need when you are in Kenya. It will act as your driving license, act as your KRA number, or rather your tax number. It's like more or less a card like a social security card in the US. The third component is now the virtual version of the card, the digital version of the card. And the last component is what we are calling National Population Register or National Population Database, which connects all the databases, the ones for the newborns, the one for those turning 18, the refugees, all immigrants in Kenya. So we want to create an interoperable national population register that will be utilized in every segment of the society. So that is the framework which we have created for digital ID ecosystem. So to just say something about governance, when listening to the presenters, we are dealing with major issues of governance as we roll out a digital ID. First, to say that initially we had planned to roll out, or rather to launch the digital ID on 2nd of October. but because of a few issues here and there, concerns about public participation, we had to move it forward a little bit by a few weeks, a few months, so that we have all the stakeholders come together and be able to agree on a solid solution for the people of Kenya. And just to re-emphasize a few issues, as we discuss and as we engage stakeholders, there are several areas which are coming very strong. Number one is public participation. The public really wants to be part and parcel of this. Two is still issues to do with data privacy. Kenyans and majority of the stakeholders are so concerned about data privacy and what we are doing to ensure that the data of Kenyans are safe. The other major issue which is coming out is the legal framework. What legal framework governs the work we are doing? And I want to say that we are doing everything possible to ensure that we meet all these expectations. And of course, what they keep on asking all the time is, what is the use of this card? Supposing I don't go for it, what happens? What will you do with me? Or that kind of thing. So we realize that we have concerns from the public. But what I wanted to say this evening or afternoon for your case is that we are doing everything possible. We are trying to bring everybody on board. We have had quite a number of consultative forums with the civil society. We have more than 500 meetings of public participation using our national administration to ensure that we close every gap and we bring everybody to work with us in this journey. So I hope I've said very much, but yeah. I hope that you're still with me. Thank you very much, Dr. Atick, once again.
I'll come back to you in a second. I think this is a good overview of where you are and your commitment to the dialogue with everybody, all the stakeholders, is well received and well appreciated. Once again, we are very, very thankful for Kenya for having been the host for this year's AGM. It was a wonderful, wonderful event, and we give all our respect and greetings to President Ruto for actually having spent 40 minutes giving a very interesting speech and where the government stands on this issue. So once again, thank you. I want to go to Malawi. Malawi is another country that has really done a brilliant job in advancing in a very short period of time, plugging the gaps, going from being one of the last countries that didn't have an identity system in Africa to being one of the leading digital identity systems. And so with us here is PS Sambo. So PS Sambo, you're also the ambassador for ID for Africa, so thank you for that. Give us a perspective on where do you think the role of digital identity stands in Malawi's development?
Thank you very much. Firstly, let me appreciate your invitation to join this livecast. And also let me take an opportunity to pass my warm regards to my brother, Ambassador Professor Julius Bitok from Malawi.
Thank you,
brothers. Yes, the Malawi National Registration Bureau was established under the National Registration Act to establish the National Population Register or to manage the national identification system. This act gives mandate to the National Registration Bureau not only to do ID management, but also to do civil registration. And there are national registration regulations that are in force since 2015. There is also the Electronic Transaction and Cybersecurity Act that is in force since 2017. So far, the progress that we have made in Malawi is to register close to 100% of the adult population and issue them with a digital identification, a unique identification for everyone. And we are also in the process of registering all the births, that is everyone who is not qualified to have a national identification card as per the legal requirements. We issue the national ID to those who are 10, 16 years and above. But in any case, the birth registration also issues the same unique identification number, which is permanent, and it is the same number that appears on the national identification card in this case, but also on the death certificate for God forbid if someone passes on, and also on the marriage registration, that's the same unique ID card. And we are anticipating to register everyone in the next few months. We believe that by that time we'll have the complete national population register where every legally acceptable individual is in the same database. We have the National Registration Act, but we are also in the process of reviewing this act. We are consulting all the stakeholders, all the CSOs, and all other players to ensure that all the gaps that are identified from the current acts are registered, are recognized and probably considered during the next act. We also are taking into consideration the data privacy. We have the Data Protection Act, which is currently with the cabinet and is expected to be in Parliament soon, just like the reviewed National Registration Act. So in short, we are probably doing the best that we can. And let me just quickly mention how the digital ID started. So it started as a project where the UNDP came in between to manage the basket fund with support or funding from the government of Malawi and other development partners. So for the past about 6 years, we have seen that the digital ID is really an enabler towards the digitalization of any aspect of life in Malawi. We have used the digital ID for the national elections, presidential elections, as well as local government elections and the parliamentary elections for 2 or 3 times now, possibly 2. And it has proven to be a very important legal identity for everyone. Let me stop here for a moment, Dr. Atick.
Yeah, no, wonderful. I mean, you are also a partner of UNDP on the governance framework. You've been working with them on that. Am I right? Yes. So the current review of the National Registration Act, we are actually looking at the UNDP governance framework. A consultant is supporting us, making sure that we are aligned to the UNDP governance framework. But also, there's the UN guidelines on model legal framework on ID and CRBS that we are also looking forward to aligning with to ensure that we are. Wonderful. And we will take up this topic again at the annual meeting face to face. But I wanted to get back to Professor Bitok and also to yourself. And you know, you are at the head of the identity authorities essentially in your countries, and you're developing an asset that's going to be in the hands of every citizen, and they're going to use it on a daily basis, hopefully multiple times a day, to change their lives, etc. And so there is some sort of weight to this and responsibility. And I want to ask you, what do you see are your biggest challenges, both from a governance point of view and from getting this tool which we call digital ID, in the hands of the people that want to use it on a daily basis. So Ambassador Bitok, what are your challenges? You're on mute. You're on mute, Ambassador.
Okay.
Yes, no.
Are you getting me now? Okay. You have asked me the question. I missed you a little bit. What are the challenges?
Yes. What are your challenges, knowing that there is a tool called digital identity in your country that is going to be hopefully in the hands of everybody and used on a daily basis. So this is not a minor thing. This is a big thing. So there's a responsibility, and therefore there is also big challenges. So I'd like to know from your perspective, what do you see your biggest challenges from the governance aspect, as well as, if you like, you can address from the adoption aspect, getting people to join?
Okay, thank you very much, Atick. Let me put it this way. Digital ID project is a very complex project, as has been presented, and from where I sit and from what I am doing, I am seeing quite a number of challenges. Number one is a challenge on the legal framework. What we've done as a country is we have decided to review the regulations that govern identity management in Kenya. Of course, there was an option of reviewing the law entirely and changing the acts and that kind of thing. But we chose the route of reviewing the regulations because we are upgrading the identity from the current identity, which is not necessarily digital, to a more digital identity product. Now, one challenge is legal. There are many civil society organizations which are asking so many questions and trying to go to court. Like, for example, today, 18th, we had a case in court. People trying to say, oh, we were not involved, we are not. So there are litigations. And the previous project, which was Uduma, what killed it actually was litigations and court cases, which were too many. There were too many cases against Uduma number. So one of the biggest challenge is there are agencies, there are entities around the world who are bringing in money, giving civil society to be able to want to be part of the stake. The second major challenge is public trust. In Kenya, we have tried it 4 times and it has not worked. So we are trying it the 5th time. So there's a lot of apathy from the public. So they are doubting, well, we did this thing before, we didn't see any result. What is going to help us? What is different from what we did? So there's a lot of mistrust from the public because the government has been trying it and not succeeding. The other major issue is on procurement. There are complex procurement issues associated with digital IT. And as you are aware, this is a game of big boys. Yes. And these big boys, each one of them has an interest. Can I get a stake here? Can I get so? At the end of the day, they complicate the entire ecosystem to the extent that it becomes very difficult to move forward. The other major challenge is, of course, on public participation. To effectively do proper public participation, you need a huge campaign, which is very expensive. So in terms of cost, then to ensure that the public are really aware, they really appreciate, they really understand, is a major challenge. The other issue, maybe the last one, is of course on resources. We are working with UNDP. Part of the agreement or part of their understanding is that they're helping us to mobilize resources because we need a lot of money to have this project move forward. Last but not least is inclusion. In the Kenyan society, it's a multi-ethnic society. So there are some communities who feel...
You went on mute.
They have never felt. Sorry. They have never felt part of the previous arrangement.
Right.
And they are fearing that there will be exclusion.
Right.
When it comes to the new digital identity. And that they fear also that they will be exposed, because some of the people are engaged with different activities and feel that they're exposed. Sorry, I've taken a lot of your time, but I wanted to highlight as many challenges as possible that we are encountering as we try to implement digital ID. Thank you.
I think this is the most honest description I've ever heard of challenges. And I think it behooves us all to understand that digital identity is fraught with challenges, and therefore we have to enter it having planned, having worked, having done everything in order to systematically overcome these challenges. And the transparency is a really important element. So I commend you for doing that. So thank you very much. So in the remaining time, PS Sambo, give us your perspective. I mean, maybe you're in alignment with Professor Bitok, with Ambassador Bitok, or you have specific issues that are context specific to Malawi. Where are your challenges in making this last ditch transition?
Thank you very much. Somewhere I am in agreement with Ambassador Professor Julius Bitok, but let me also just add to the list. Basically, you know, the understanding of a digital ID and probably the use of the digital ID is also a very big challenge that needs to be communicated very well to everyone. So when the digital ID concept was developed in Malawi, the CSOs were involved, the National Initiative on Civic Education. They went around the whole country, letting people know what is the digital ID and what is the use of this ID and what's the advantage of the ID to the individuals as well as to the economic development of the country. Now, the other challenges we are getting, you know, the digital ID we have is currently based on the card, the plastic card. But, you know, printing these cards is a challenge. And our cards are embedded with a chip. This digital chip, you know, the chips are scarce in the world. The demand is just too high. And it's also another challenge that we are having. As a solution, we are considering the virtual digital ID, the concept which has already been tested and we are piloting right now. But on top of all this, we are also looking at what is a guiding law to implement the digital card or the virtual card and everything else. The current law is lacking it's not very clear to say these are the limitations and this is what we can do. I also talk about a challenge of registering other vulnerable people like the refugees. The current act does not specifically, it's not very clear to say the institution can register refugees. So looking at all this, the review of the National Registration Act that I've just talked about, we are considering all these limitations, and there are also other special amendments to that the review is going to recommend, like the Marriage and Family Relations Divorce Act, Child Protection Act, all these other acts or laws will have to be consequentially amended because we have identified some gaps along the way where we have to do better to look around the current state where we are in 2023 as compared to probably 2010. And you know, the digital ID concept, the technology is advancing very fast and we need to catch up with the advancement. Over.
Excellent. Thank you so much, yes, Sambo. I think between the two of you, I think we can see two things, that the landscape is challenging, but we can also see a spirit of tenacity, that both of you are committed to actually overcoming all the challenges in a systematic and transparent way, including reform of legal frameworks and regulations. And also incorporating civil society as a partner in this journey, because at the end of the day, no country can afford to sit with this one out. You cannot afford to say, well, we're going to miss out on digital identity. I mean, this is not an acceptable outcome, as the world is now realizing the importance of digital ID. So with that, we ran out of time, but I will commit to the community that both of you will honor us with your presence at the annual general meeting, and we will continue this discussion in the appropriate context. Hopefully by then we would have additional updates on how you've been dealing with these challenges. So let me thank you once again for taking the time from your very busy schedules. And we will continue with the audience with another segment, which is the NIST guidelines. I hope everybody can stay with us, because in this segment, we are joined by an illustrious lineup of experts from NIST. NIST, as many of you know, is a renowned institution in the identity field. They set the global standard, they establish performance benchmarks, and they provide guidelines. Their influence extends across identity management, credentials, biometrics, cybersecurity, and a long list of related digital transformation practices. Their outputs have proven to be crucial for governments and private sector entities involved in identification, and their impartiality, quality, and comprehensiveness consistently earn profound respect from the technical community. We are thrilled today to have with us three key authors of a body of work called NIST Special Publication 800-63, which is now in its fourth revision and is known as the NIST Guidelines for Digital Identity, considered by many as one of the most important bodies of work on digital identity. This segment will consist of a series of presentations to explore the guidelines. And if we have specific questions about the guidelines, we can take them maybe along the way as well as at the end. And I should say that this is actually part of a broader collaboration between ID for Africa and NIST, for which we are very, very thankful and grateful, as NIST will be joining us also at the AGM with a specific symposium focused on performance and standardization, etc. So with that in mind, I will once again welcome our NIST colleagues, Ryan, Connie, and David, and I will hand the floor to you, Ryan, to kick this segment off. Thank you once again.
Thank you very much, Dr. Atick. That was an absolutely fantastic introduction. I don't think anyone's ever referred to me as illustrious before, but I do greatly appreciate it. I also apologize for being a little bit late. I am on the West Coast right now at a conference talking about FIDO and FIDO authenticators. So I apologize for not being here sooner, but I'm very excited to be on right now. And I think David's pulling up the slides for us, but excellent. So we're going to provide a quick overview, not just of the guidance today, but also talk a little bit about our digital identity program. And so my role here at NIST is as the identity program lead. And basically what that means is I work with a very broad cross-sector of different efforts and initiatives within NIST to help make sure that we can strategically connect various different projects and efforts. As Dr. Atick said, we have a very strong team that works on things like biometrics. We've got teams that work on internal identity programs for our federal employees, as well as those that work on things like mobile driver's license, authorization, access management. And so my role as the identity program lead is to kind of connect these teams, bring them together, but also to work very closely on things like 863, our digital identity guidelines. I don't know if we have the ability to do like shows of hands here, but out of curiosity, hopefully everyone here knows who NIST is and what NIST does, but just in case you don't, our mission is to promote U.S. innovation and industrial competitiveness by advancing measurement science, standards, and technology in ways that enhance security, economic security, and improve our quality of life. At the end of the day, what that means is our role is to help establish and create guidelines and standards for the federal government, as well as to do measurement science and research around those things. And that is not just within cybersecurity. This covers everything from manufacturing to physical sciences. We have an entire catalog of what we call standard reference materials. And these are things that have been established as standards within the United States and in some cases internationally as core materials that can be used as a reference for any kind of research or evaluation. One of the things we're most famous for, including the atomic clock, is a jar of standard reference peanut butter. It's like one of the most expensive jars of peanut butter on Earth, but it's used in research around caloric intake and stuff like that. So we do everything from that to quantum computing, to cybersecurity. Most folks know our cybersecurity framework extremely well, which is seen very wide adoption, not just within the United States, but also internationally. So we kind of cover the gamut and the spectrum across the board as far as pretty much anything you could standardize and measure, we are engaged in, and that's the work that we do. Next slide. But as a program, what does that mean for what we do within identity? And I'll get to some of the outputs and products that we have, but we've really started in the past, probably a couple of years here, to kind of reconsolidate around the idea of establishing a programmatic view around identity. It's becoming much more consequential and important, not that it wasn't in the past, but it's starting to be more present and more kind of upfront within society. And we've started to see a lot more discussions of this kind of in the civil space. And so we've started to get, sit together and help establish what we think as being core objectives, and something to also think about as we go through this, that where we kind of differ in some of our responsibilities than perhaps some of the other folks who have presented today as national representatives, is we really do focus exclusively on the kind of measurement science, standards and guidance side of the house. We don't create regulation. We don't create policy. We create standards and measurement that support broader policy decisions that are made elsewhere. So while we don't necessarily set an overall strategy or agenda for the nation, we do support those strategic outcomes. And based on that, we've helped create kind of these key program objectives that we're looking to really infuse into almost all the work that we do going forward. One of the keys and one of the basic things that is kind of elemental to everything we do is enhancing security and threat protection. So this is really starting to look at what's changing in the identity space. And this is a lot of what we've built into why we're doing updates to 863, our digital identity guidelines. What are those new threats? What are those new evolving attack patterns that we're starting to see? And how do those impact and influence both the research we're doing in our guidance as well too? We're looking to integrate better considerations and measurement around equity and individual choice. So how do we bring new technologies into our guidance and into our research to help make sure that we're creating more effective pathways for a broader set of population to have positive outcomes when interacting with digital identity technology, but also how do we build in different measurements and evaluatory processes to make sure that we are helping agencies and organizations serve their communities better. We're looking to promote privacy, usability, and accessibility. I think the privacy on here is one that we are really leaning away from simply looking at things like privacy policies and moving more towards how can we actually build privacy preserving technology into what we're doing. How do we consider things like zero knowledge proofs in the future? How do we think about things like integrating more effective technologies for protecting machine learning and AI models from reversing and engineering and identifying people's PII? So how do we actually build the technology layer in from a privacy perspective into what we're doing from an identity model? And then also from a usability and accessibility perspective, how do we again integrate those technologies that can help advance the ability for individuals to better access services and solutions? We want to enhance interoperability and standardization. Again, we're a standards organization, so interoperability is at the core of what we do. But this is really starting to take and pull apart some of the work that we do to take that next level of, we have 863 in the digital identity guidelines. How do we take those to the next level when engaging with international standards bodies and organizations to create things like profiles of federation specifications to help profile things like emerging wallet standards, and make sure that we've got not just the core standard, but a standard that's going to work for the government sector as well as other commercial sectors. And then finally, improving measurement and transparency. And this is, as Dr. Atick said, we're going to have our colleagues from the biometrics team who will be attending the in-person session later this year. But also, biometrics is a key component of what we do, but also how can we take similar models of measurement and evaluation that our biometrics colleagues have created and apply those to other aspects of identity. How can we measure the whole process more effectively? And hopefully, if some of you get the opportunity to read 863 Revision 4, our most current draft, you'll notice we've added more metrics, we've added more considerations around things like continuous improvement, and David and Connie will cover that in a bit more detail. Next slide. So just to kind of talk about what our role is within digital identity within the federal government, as I noted probably a dozen times already, we focus on standardization. We have like a few core artifacts that are the things that we build towards and establish and create overall. And so we establish guidelines. And for us, these are things like our special publications, our digital identity guidelines, and these are mandatory for federal government use, but they're actually widely adopted as well too for commercial use. We write them for the purposes of our federal government colleagues and within that purview. However, we also try and write them with an eye to broader adoption and to establish greater uptake of these kinds of guidance more broadly. And I think we've seen this internationally as well too, where there was some influence on the original EIDAS from our levels assurance back in 863 Revision 2. So we really try and use these as documents that help both set the bar for what we do within the federal government, but also create a standard that can be adopted more broadly by the international and commercial spaces. We do also develop standards. So standards vary slightly from guidance in that there is a different set of legal authorities around them, but our federal information processing standards, most people are kind of most familiar with like FIPS 140, which is our cryptographic programs, but we've also got FIPS 201, which is our federal personal identity verification card guidance. Those are also mandatory, but we also work very closely in international standards bodies. So we are one of the primary representatives from the US federal government to organizations like ISO, IETF, W3C, FIDO. If there's an acronym that does standard stuff, we have people there who are engaging and working and helping to drive some of those core identity standards. The next big thing that we do is what we call applied and foundational research. And so these are two different concepts, but very similar in nature. Our foundational research is what we kind of typically consider to be pre-standardization work. This is how do we understand new and emerging technologies? How do we understand what standards will need to be established around them or how these will impact standards? And then on the applied research side, this is when we take existing standards or standards we've helped create and attempt to identify pathways for adoption or challenges to adoption to help advance the actual uptake of those standards. So foundational is the pre-standardization side, applied is on the how do we increase and engage in the uptake side of the house. A lot of our applied research is done within our National Cybersecurity Center of Excellence, which is in Maryland in the United States. We do a lot of really great work with trying to take those standards, international standards, NIST standards, and bring them into implementation. And then finally, enhancing metrology and coming up with metrology around identity. At the moment, this is heavily biometrics influenced, and the fact that that's one of the most measurable aspects of identity at this point in time, but we're really looking to understand how we can apply this metrology to other things. Things like document validation, things like performance across demographic groups, and really bring those into our guidance and our research overall. And so some of the things we have going on, and it's a lot, but these are a few of the key things and things that might be of particular note to this group as well too. One, we're updating the digital identity guidelines, and that is, we're in our revision 4 draft period right now. We received almost 4,000 comments. And we're reviewing and updating based upon those. And we are hoping to have another draft version of these out for public comment, at least the base volume, the proofing volume, and the federation volume, probably around March. We'll probably go final with our authentication volume around that time. We're also working very heavily in the mobile driver's license space, working both on the ISO standard as well as working on a project within our National Cybersecurity Center of Excellence to actually deploy and implement the online use case. So what's being influenced as being the kind of ability to leverage these things, not just in a physical interaction, but in an online interaction. We're doing research around identity verification and attribute validation, as well as working very closely with our colleagues on zero trust work. So there's a lot of different factors that we have going on. These are just a few of them, but we do more than just 863, and a lot of the core research that we have to do here feeds back into our digital guidelines. Next slide. There we go. So what are the digital identity guidelines? And I think after this, I'll be handing off to Connie. The digital identity guidelines are the foundational technical requirements and procedural requirements and process requirements that we have for identity. It consists of 4 core volumes. We've got the base, which covers identity risk assessment, as well as establishing the contextual and taxonomy of the overall volumes. So it creates, the kind of core model for understanding that flows through all the other ones. 863A covers identity proofing and enrollment, and the processes for how you establish and understand an identity at its core and at the starting point, and enroll them in an identity service. Authentication and lifecycle management. This is how we describe the requirements for all of our authenticators, how you manage sessions and how you manage recovery of those accounts within the lifecycle. Federation and assertions, and this is really how you convey identity information between 2 connected partners. And the idea between each one of these, we don't cover authorization, but this is everything that is kind of needed to establish an identity, convey an identity, and authenticate users, and do it in a consistent way. We have different levels of assurance within each one of these. So something that we did that was a difference between our previous version, 863-2 and 863-3, and has carried through into 4, is we've established assurance levels that are tied to each of the processes. So there's an identity assurance level, there's an authentication assurance level, there's a federation assurance level. We no longer have the kind of monolithic LOA 1 through 4 that we had previously. And then finally, one of the big things that we've done both with the previous version and with this is we've integrated privacy enhancing requirements, privacy enhancing technologies and concepts, usability and equity concepts all into the document to make sure they get the same kind of consideration and integration into the actual development process for some of these solutions as just your kind of core security versions as well too. So I think with that, I'm going to hand off to Connie, who will cover the base volume.
Great, thank you, Ryan. So Ryan sort of alluded to this already, but I'll just go over what you can expect from the base volume. And to clarify, I'll largely be talking about revision 3 of the digital identity guidelines. Though near the end of this segment of our presentation, I'll get into some of the amendments through revision 4 that you can expect from NIST. Maybe not in their final presentation, but maybe a teaser of the direction that we're going. So on your screen, you see some high level features of the base volume. First, it introduces and describes some pretty foundational concepts that are then used throughout the remaining 3 volumes, A, B, and C, which you'll hear from David about later. It also presents a digital identity model, which offers a high-level overview of the general roles and functions that you can expect from the entities listed here. We'll dive into that in the next slide. But the third piece that I think is really important to highlight is the risk assessment methodology that's offered in the base volume, which is something that we've revamped a bit between revision 3 and revision 4. And we will get to that in just a bit. So going to the next slide, diving into the digital identity model, you've got a couple of functions, you've got a couple of roles. You might see, based on context, some of this switched around. You might see terms used that don't exactly match up to this, but at a high level, trying to get on the same page with the language that we're using, at least in the context of the NIST publication. You can expect a couple of different roles to be presented. So starting on the left with that blue box, you see a subject. A subject is an individual, and they wear different caps depending on the point in the process they find themselves in. The first would be an applicant. You're applying to a service. You're going through those initial steps in establishing your identity online in many cases. You also have the relying party, who you see on the far right at the top. A relying party could be a bank. It could be a government agency that's providing some sort of service. It could be your pharmacy, right? So this is a general term applied to that kind of entity that an individual is seeking to engage in a transaction with. You also see on your screen a verifier, and a CSP. The verifier verifies authentication transactions. And you can expect from the CSP or credential service provider that they will be engaged in the proofing of an individual and the enrollment of them as the next cap that an individual would wear, which would be the subscriber. When that individual returns to an account, returns to service where they've already engaged with that relying party for the first time, you would refer to them as a claimant. So just a little bit of nuance around the terms that you'll see used and the context, but just know that all of those terms under subject generally refer to the individual. As far as the functions, I won't read all of them out. It's pretty self-explanatory, but generally speaking, the individual needs to be proofed, typically by the CSP. There's the function of registration and enrollment that takes place. Additionally, you need to have some sort of brokered authentication take place, including an understanding of the level of access that individual would have. In some cases, like in a federated circumstance, you would need to determine what level of federation assurance is needed and the underlying technology and processes that would broker that federation transaction. And then again, when somebody comes back to log in with the relying party, that would be represented by the model as well. So that brings up a question that we get a lot, which is like, how do you express the level of rigor and the controls, or the quote unquote assurance level, as we would refer to it? In this next slide, you can see that rather than having a catch-all assurance level, which I know some countries use, sometimes you have LOA 1, 2, 3, you could have LOA 1, 2, 3, 4, which was the case for NIST for quite a while. But with the prior revision, we broke out those assurance levels into identity assurance, or IAL, authentication assurance, or AAL, and then federation assurance, FAL. That's not to say that this is clear-cut all the time, especially with some emerging models of digital identity. The lines tend to get blurred, but for the sake of our collective sanity and using consistent language, we've maintained these as broken out assurance levels. So generally speaking, when we talk about identity assurance level, we're talking about the robustness of the identity proofing process. So resolution, validation, and verification of evidence, and ensuring that the person who's claiming an identity is who they say they are, with a relatively high, moderate, or low degree of confidence. Similarly, authentication assurance refers to not only the technology, but the processes and the governance around authentication. I know governance has been talked about a lot today, and that is a theme that permeates all of these levels in one way or the other. The last bit in a federated environment is the federation assurance level, which again touches on the robustness of the federation protocol, or protocols used to convey authentication status and attribute information from the identity provider to the relying party. Last but not least, this is what I alluded to with the risk assessment methodology and some of the changes that we have introduced in the draft of revision 4 that we're actively entering into the writing phase for after a very robust period of engagement in the comment period. So we're shifting to more of a process versus a check the box kind of approach that I know often you find in an implementation context. So first, we want folks to conduct an initial risk and impact assessment. This is where you would see things like not only security of the relying party's systems considered, but also privacy considerations for the individual who's interacting with that system. And to some extent, where there might be a systemic risk for an entire community, how are you contemplating those risks to individuals, to communities, beyond organizational assets, operations, and people? How are you also specifically calling out equity and usability as considerations right alongside privacy and security? These are fairly new ways of thinking about equity. But in meeting our adopters of NIST Special Publication 800-63 where they are, they tend to understand security risk management, information management. So to use their language to start a conversation about equity, inclusion, accessibility, and the importance of engaging a diverse set of communities as you're designing and managing systems, we've gotten a lot of feedback that this makes sense to them. And now we just need to get from a high level concept of risk down into more practical guidance. So for those of you for whom this resonates, we would love to hear from you and partner with you. I'm really excited to be here today. This is my first engagement with this particular community, but I think your perspectives are very much needed as we are contemplating this new approach to risk assessment. So that's just a quick plug to please stay engaged with NIST. So beyond that initial risk assessment, though, you would see an initial selection of an assurance level for identity proofing and enrollment, for authentication, and where applicable, for federation. From there, where needed, we've introduced this concept. It's not necessarily new for security or system management, but tailoring that assurance level to meet the needs of your user population, or frankly, to adapt it to your risk profile. And then last but not least, I know that monitoring, evaluation, research, and learning is not new for certain communities, but really doubling down on the need to continuously evaluate, in part because we know that people are not going to get this right and perfect off the bat. So what's really more important is that they have a growth mindset, that they have the governance in place to understand where something is working and where it is not, and then to adapt their approach in an iterative way as they learn. So this is the general high-level approach that we've considered and that we've included in the updated base volume. With that, I will shift to David, who will give an overview of Volume A. Thank you.
Thanks, Connie. And before we get into the functions and roles and each of the volumes, I'd like to just pause for a minute to see if there's any points that we need to clarify in the overview of NIST that Ryan gave, or the overview of the base volume, but the digital identity guidelines that Connie provided. Before we dig in deeper, just to make sure that if there's anything that needs to be clarified, we can do that at this point.
Yes, thank you for that pause. Just to tell the communities that's online, please submit your questions into the Q&A regarding this portion of the NIST presentation so far. I know the identity assurance levels and has resonated very significantly with our community. So if anybody wants any clarifications, anything related to what was presented, please don't hesitate to ask now. Otherwise, we could try to see something at the end. So we'll take just a minute. I don't know if the community will raise any questions. If not, David, prepare to move forward.
I do see a couple, Professor or Doctor in the chat. I think is NIST planning to segment the digital identity specifications to reflect emerging technologies? I think the best way to answer this is yes, to a certain extent. So we've already attempted to do that with A, B, and C to segment out at least technologies that apply to proofing, authentication, and federation. But we're also looking to, within the volumes coming up in our next revision, apply more considerations for things around like mobile driver's license and verifiable credentials that are starting to emerge, and making sure those are effectively reflected in our guidance so folks can see where it is. There's another question here for question to NIST. There was a call for comments earlier in 2023. Is a review of these comments still in progress? When will the next draft be released? So yes, there was a call for comments earlier this year. We released the initial public draft of revision 4. We are reviewing over 4,000 comments. We're about 90% done with going through those. And again, I think our goal would be to try and have another draft of the base volume 63A and 63C out for public comment sometime late Q2 24, early Q3 24, so March, April timeframe. 63B we will probably go final with.
There are two quick questions. One was in the chat about, is there an ISO standard for identity?
Yes, there are actually a few. So there's 29115, which I believe is the authentication framework, David. And there's
and 27460 is the framework for identity.
And there's 29003, which is I believe a technical specification, not a standard for identity proofing. There's also 18013-5 and -7, which are the mobile driver's license standards. There's actually a lot of identity standards within ISO. I think it depends on which specific type of identity standard you're looking for.
And a wide range of standards dealing with biometric technologies. So.
Yeah, exactly. And is NIST also considering a standardization of KERI, key event receipt infrastructure, is the first truly fully decentralized identity system?
I'll admit I'm not familiar with KERI, but we'd be happy to follow up and find out a little bit more.
There is a reference online on the Q&A, KERI.1. I'm not familiar with it either. And finally, the presentation. People have been asking, will we make the presentation available? Assuming that NIST is okay with us sharing the presentation, clearly we would be. So operator, send these instructions in the chat for how people can receive the presentation. You'd have to ask for it. So please just put the instructions for how we do that. I assume NIST will not have any problem sharing this public presentation.
No, we're good with that.
Okay. Okay. I think we can proceed.
All right, thank you. So let me get into 63A, the volume that deals of the four, that deals with identity proofing and enrollment. And starting with the identity proofing process is an evidence-based process for identity proofing. Unlike some of the presentations that we've heard earlier today, the United States doesn't have a national ID. So in order to be able to determine the identity of any of the public that want to access our online services, whether those are government services, government agency services, or anybody that's using the digital identity guidelines, we're reliant upon identity evidence and documentation that may be supplied by the subject, which Connie described as the applicant in an identity proofing process. So the identity proofing process looks at and evaluates the identity evidence that's presented in an identity proofing process and ties that to the applicant, validates the information, and I'll go through the steps for that. The Volume A provides the process and the procedures for identity proofing at the identity assurance levels, as well as the technical requirements. We provide for both in-person identity proofing sessions, as well as remote identity proofing sessions. And you'll hear from us that there are 3 steps, core identity proofing steps involved in the identity proofing process: identity resolution, identity validation, and identity verification. I'll drill down a little bit on that. We also provide for the evidence that's submitted, what we can consider as legitimate evidence, as well as the strengths of evidence. Expect that the strength of evidence will vary based on the level of confidence or the level of assurance that's necessary in order to be able to allow access to that online service. And I'll mention this here, Connie also mentioned this, as well as Ryan. Every volume, A, B, and C, have separate requirements for privacy, security, usability, and now equity in our new volume. And not only requirements, but we also present considerations for any of the processes or technologies to make sure that the approaches that we take for digital identity management are privacy protecting, usable by the population, as well as provide for equitable access to our government's online services. So for identity proofing, it consists of 3 steps in volume A. Identity resolution, and in identity resolution, this is where identity documentation and evidence is collected so that there's sufficient evidence and identity information, which we call core attributes, about the individual to be able to prove their identity and that they are a unique person, a real person in the population being served, but also a unique person. Validation is validating the evidence and the documentation that's been presented in the identity proofing process. And verification binds the applicant, the real life person involved in the identity proofing, to the evidence itself. Typically, that will require a confirmation of the owner's or the applicant's possession and ownership of that identity documentation and evidence. So for resolution, identity resolution, this is to collect sufficient information. Typically, that's in the form of evidence and identity documentation, as well as possibly additional information or core attributes if there's not sufficient information on the evidence that's provided to uniquely distinguish the applicant in the population that's being served. For evidence being collected, we use both physical evidence and physical documents, as well as digital evidence, such as a mobile driver's license or a verifiable credential can be presented as forms of identity documentation and evidence. The evidence needs to be evaluated for its strength. As I indicated, we provide requirements for strength of evidence that's presented. Consider that to be fair, strong, or superior strength of evidence, and it will vary by the identity assurance level that's required by the online service in order to allow access. And in the end, identity resolution provides confidence that the claimed identity is a real person in the population being served and a unique person in that population. Validation represents the confirmation that the evidence and documentation that's been presented is authentic and that the information is in fact accurate and correct. And let me point out that because we don't have a national ID, the types of evidence and identity documentation that are typically presented are things like driver's license, passport, immigration documents that are issued by specific issuing authorities, and then the documentation can be checked or validated through those issuing authorities, which we consider to be an authoritative source. Identity evidence is inspected to determine its authenticity and genuineness, with checks for any tampering, modification, alteration of the document, checking for security features. And as Ryan pointed out, we are doing research to check on how well automated document authentication services can provide for that form of document inspection and evaluation. So the process can be manual or through an automated process for determining authenticity. The next step involved in validation is checking that the information on that evidence is in fact correct and can be corroborated by authoritative sources. The sources are the issuer of the evidence and sources that have linkage to that evidence and can check those types of records in order to validate the information. Where digital identity evidence may be digitally signed, such as a mobile driver's license, which we see emerging as across different implementations in the US, and as Ryan pointed out, there's a ISO standard that's advancing mobile driver's license development and implementation. That requires validation. To be considered evidence, we require that that form of digital evidence is digitally signed by the issuing authority, and that digital signature can be verified through validating the digital signature of the digital evidence that's presented. So identity validation of the evidence protects against imposters presenting fraudulent or stolen evidence, and potentially trying to fraudulently claim the identity, the claimed identity in the identity proofing process. Now, in verification, once the evidence is validated, verification process confirms that the applicant that's presenting the evidence is the real life person for that claimed identity. Typically, we require a comparison of the facial image of the applicant in the process to the facial portrait on the identity evidence or documentation that's been presented. This can be done through a visual comparison of where the process is in person, or if it's being conducted remotely, through an automated process, which requires a automated biometric system comparison of the biometric, the facial image that's presented, to typically a selfie or a video recording of the applicant taken during the identity proofing session. The identity verification process protects against an imposter using stolen evidence to fraudulently claim another person's identity. Those 3 steps are the core steps for identity proofing in volume A. And I'll just drill down a little bit on this because for the summary slide, because this is what we refer to as identity proofing, and what Connie showed on the overall model chart. In order to be enrolled in an identity service, there must be successful identity proofing, identity resolution, confidence that the claimed identity is a real and unique person in the population that's being served, and there's sufficient evidence to support that strength of evidence for the claimed assurance level that's necessary to gain access. Validation is the confidence that the evidence is in fact real and authentic, and it applies to the person involved in the identity proofing process. Verification is the confidence that the applicant that's presenting this is the actual real life person to whom that evidence and identity documentation belongs. The assurance levels will vary on the processes and technical requirements for these 3 steps based on identity assurance levels, low, moderate, and high, which we enumerate as identity assurance levels 1, 2, and 3. Now, I would like to talk a little bit about the sensitivity of the use of biometric information in identity proofing. Biometrics can be used for both identity proofing to kind of prove that the individual that's involved in the identity proofing process actually is the person represented by the evidence being presented. But identity proofing can also be used for authentication, and I'll describe that a little bit later. What we want to make sure is, in order to gain access to the government service, that if a biometric, a selfie photo or a video recording is going to be collected, that the public understands what it's going to be used for, any retention for that biometric, and how that biometric characteristic and data can be ultimately and will be ultimately deleted. We look to have the credential service provider that's obtaining this, conducting the identity proofing process, to acquire consent before biometrics are collected. The biometric retention and deletion is important. Again, we call for a notice to advise the public of this is what the biometrics will be used for, the purposes for that, as well as any retention period and how it ultimately will be used. We do require the biometrics that are system biometrics because algorithms are used in order to do the comparison of a live capture of a facial image to the facial portrait on identity documentation and evidence. We do require that those algorithms are tested. I would call attention to the NIST publications regarding the tests. We don't evaluate the algorithms. We just have them tested in a standardized laboratory environment and post the results of the algorithm's performance. We look to have the best performing algorithms, and especially the best performing algorithms across different demographic populations and communities used for identity proofing for the government services. We therefore provide for performance metrics for identity proofing algorithms. And we do look to say that the liveness detection capability needs to be present in order to be able to determine that what's being presented actually is a live capture of the actual person involved in the identity proofing process rather than just a picture. We'll take additional questions at the end, but I'd like to now get into a little bit on volume 63B, the digital identity guidelines for authentication and authenticator lifecycle management. So Connie introduced some of these terms. I'll provide detail on how that works in the 4-volume set. What we just described in volume A, identity proofing, provides confidence in the identity of an applicant that's enrolling into an identity service or an online service. It's the front end identity proofing that yes, this individual is evaluated based on the identity evidence that is presented and can be allowed to be enrolled in the online service. Authentication is the processes that are involved to provide confidence that that proven identity can return to the online service and is the same person that was registered through the applicant registration and identity proofing processes that are described in volume A. The authentication is accomplished by proving possession and control of authenticators, and I'll describe what authenticators are in a moment, that are registered to the subscriber upon enrollment, and the authenticator secrets that they can present. I'll just describe one of the things that's important in the guidelines is volume B describes for different levels of assurance, like all 3 of the volumes A, B, and C. But we do require for the federal government that multi-factor authentication is required in order to access government online service accounts. It's the combination of at least 2 different authentication factors. This is a different term than authenticators, but authentication factors are things like something that you know, typically a password or PIN, something that you have, consider it a possession-based authentication factor, with like an OTP that's sent to a registered device or a cryptographic key that's maintained by the individual, or something that you are as an authentication factor, which can be a biometric characteristic. Multi-factor authentication is required for authentication assurance levels 2 and 3. So authenticators, following the successful identity proofing, the CSP will establish a subscriber account. That subscriber account can contain attribute information that was validated during the identity proofing process, but also registers one or more authenticators to that individual, so that that individual can be authenticated to return to the online service without being identity proofed all over again. The authenticators are used to verify digital identities without repeating that identity proofing process. The authenticators are something that you know, the PIN or password, or something that you have, a mobile phone or other type of device that can be where the subscriber's possession of that authenticator can be proven. Authenticators must comprise or contain a secret that is expressed in authentication protocols to allow the verifier of the authentication transaction to be able to verify that only this individual could have this authenticator because they are aware of the secrets and can present them in output in the authentication protocol. Quickly on the authenticators types, something that you know, memorized secrets. The rest are all that you see on this screen are all possession-based authenticators. Lookup secrets is a card or other grid of secrets that are used in sequence in order to conduct an authentication transaction. Out-of-band authentication devices are things like phones, that a mobile phone where a message can be sent out of band, out of the online access to that device and have that secret expressed. Single factor OTP device generates through a seed that both the verifier and that particular authenticator, that device, possess in order to generate one-time passwords at that time. And the forms of multi-factor and single-factor cryptographic authenticators are those types of authenticators, either in software or hardware, that can perform cryptographic authentication functions, typically a challenge and response, which would be, again, unique to the authenticator and proves possession, that the individual that wants to gain access is in fact in possession of that authenticator. But I'll spend a moment on biometrics, because what you don't see as authenticators on this chart is a biometric characteristic. And the issue really is that for facial image is not a secret. A picture of just about anybody can be obtained online or through other means and can't be considered a secret. So we don't consider a biometric characteristic to be capable for single factor authentication as a separate authentication factor. However, we do consider that biometric characteristics are very convenient and very usable as one of the factors involved in multi-factor authentication. And that's how it's treated in Volume B. Biometric characteristics, again, is something that you are like a fingerprint or a facial image, but can also be something that you do, behavioral characteristics, voice patterns, and the like. There are limitations, as I indicated, for biometrics. One, they're not a secret. And for that reason, we don't allow them for single factor authentication, but we do allow them based for the convenience and the usability now for using a biometric characteristic as one of the factors for multi-factor authentication. And we also point out that unlike other forms of authenticators where if compromised, the authenticator can be revoked, that can't happen with a biometric characteristic. And the last point I'll mention on this is that biometric comparison algorithms and biometric systems can and do vary in performance. And while we set, as I pointed out, biometric algorithm performance metrics, we also want to make sure that any variation across communities and demographic groups is minimized. So we look to be able to ensure that common performance it can be performed across different groups, different demographic communities for different types of comparison algorithms, and all biometric authentication that's across all three volumes, A, B, and C of 63 are one-to-one comparisons. We do permit, but we don't require a one-to-many match. And I'm gonna address volume C, which, as Connie pointed out, addresses federation and assertions. And let me describe this capability. So I'll start with, well, federation provides for the conveyance of authentication information as well as identity information for the subscriber that's involved from a verifier to a relying party if the relying party does not provide that verification function. Now, let me put that into context. A relying party, again, is the online service that subscribers, basically the public in the US, wanting to access the government's online services, which requires a identity proofing to prove the identity of that subscriber, as well as to bind authenticators to that subscriber in a subscriber account. Here you see that the chart shows an IDP in the upper right-hand corner, where up to this point, I've been referring to that as a credential service provider, or CSP, that does the identity proofing, establishes and maintains the subscriber account, and registers authenticators to that account, and will provide for the verification function of those authenticators that this is, in fact, this subscriber returning through an authentication protocol. If the online service, what federation allows is for the online service to not have to do the identity proofing, to not have to establish separate subscriber accounts and register authenticators and perform the registration. So there's a big benefit to the online service providers to use federation processes, but there's also a big benefit to the subscribers, because now the subscriber doesn't need to be identity proofed wherever they want to go in the federal government, but can just consider it a shared service. We call the credential service provider if they're providing that type of shared service for authentication, an identity provider or IDP. So that's the reason why you see this as kind of this particular chart. Now let me walk through what happens in this. The subscriber wants to access, and this is the arrow that you see in the right hand, in the bottom of the screen. The subscriber wants to access the government's online service, but through prior arrangement, that online service has established a trust agreement with an IDP that, yes, we trust what the IDP does, and that the IDP can authenticate those subscribers that it has identity proofed and registered in their identity service, to authenticate them and pass that status to the online service. So through that establishment of that trust agreement, there is a relationship, a trust relationship between the relying party, the online service, and the IDP. So the subscriber, in wanting to access the online service has done what Connie had previously described, a risk assessment of their online services, determined that they need both an identity assurance level IAL2, for example, as well as an authentication assurance level for multi-factor authentication, AAL2, and established that, that agreement in their trust agreement with the IDP. The individual, the subscriber in this case, is redirected from the relying party to the IDP, where the IDP will ask for authenticators to prove that they are in fact the owner of that account, that subscriber account, through successful communication and authentication from the subscriber to the IDP that's acting as the verifier in this. Identity information and attribute information, as well as authentication status, is passed from the IDP to the relying party, to the online service, so an account can, so that a session can be created and the subscriber can gain online access. This is very common, but as I pointed out, it's also very beneficial to the overall government's online services, to the, and particularly for the subscriber, because the subscriber doesn't need to create separate accounts wherever they want to go in the federal government. And as I pointed out, the subscriber does not authenticate directly to the relying party or the online service. Instead, they use a federation protocol through an IDP. We have, I'll bring up in just a moment what we would see in an assertion, but we want to apply this same model that we have for other forms of digital identity management and potential digital credentials that the subscriber might maintain as well. And through federation, the subscriber can obtain services from multiple online services without needing to be identity proofed and establish separate accounts with separate authenticators wherever they want to go in the federal government. So just a moment on federation assertions. Assertions convey the following information in the federation transaction. And consider assertion to be a message in a standard format that's passed from the identity provider, the IDP, to the online service, the relying party, where they've established a trust agreement to be able to verify the authentication status of subscribers of that IDP. A subject identifier who is involved in this transaction. The issuer identifier is the IDP. Check to make sure that this is the IDP involved in this trust agreement. The audience identifier is the relying party. Make sure that this is that the relying party is in fact the service that this is assertions being directed to. Both the assertions are time stamped, as well as there's validity periods for the assertions. And the point I wanted to make on this is the entire assertion is digitally signed by the IDP. So it's also verified, and the integrity of the assertion information can be verified by the online service in order to allow access to their online services and transactions and systems. We want to see that assertions specify the identity assurance level, authentication assurance level, and federation assurance level that's needed in order for authorization to be granted to make the decision-making for authorization easier for that relying party in order to create an active session for that subscriber. And we do recognize that additional attribute information can be passed from the ID. This is identity information about the subscriber can be passed from the IDP to the relying party to help for the relying party to identify that particular user in their overall system. So we've covered a lot of material here. And a lot of context. What I would like to do is to pause here give our thanks and appreciation to Dr. Atick, as well as the ID for Africa program, to allowing us to come on and just explain a little bit about the digital identity guidelines. But also, what you see is our email address on this slide. So if you do have comments, questions, or we'll have this deck posted. And if you do have comments, questions, or you would like to just be in communication with us, that's our email address. That comes to us, Connie, Ryan, and myself. And we will respond and communicate with you as a result. But we'll pause here and see if there's questions for
David,
the information that we provided.
David and team, actually, let's end the sharing. Yeah, we ran out of time, but there is one question that the community keeps asking, and I think it's an important question that we take on. And that's the question of attestation for identity proofing, because in the context of Africa, quite often there isn't any documentation that we can use for the invisible people other than the attestation of coming from other people who are known, who are vetted. And so the question is NIST exploring attestation? And this could be two types of attestation. Could be the social media attestation. For example, somebody that has 5,000 to 10,000 links on LinkedIn, for example, is clearly somebody that exists, because we have 10,000 people that are actually saying who this person is. So how do we attest using social media? And also, how do we attest using letters of introduction and recommendations, which are very common in Africa, but I have not seen it as part of the identity proofing protocols that you've been working on?
Yeah, we are introducing a new concept in the draft revision 4, which we call an applicant reference. Now, this would be for circumstances where the applicant that's involved in an identity proofing process doesn't have the documentation that we specify, where an individual that has a relationship or otherwise can know this individual and be able to present information and vouch for information about the identity information for the individual in order to be able to address those circumstances that you're describing. We're trying this out. We proposed it in the draft revision 4. We got lots of comments, but we do intend to maintain that concept as well as that approach as we move to finalize the documents.
We do need it. In Africa, we absolutely need that concept, and count us in, because it's happening, meaning we would like to see a guideline that really captures that, because in over 50% of the cases that are happening in Africa, it is the reference, it's the attestation that really is used ultimately. So please work with us on this particular concept. And then a related one in the developed context is, how do you see social media providing some form of reference? Is there some sort of an AI metric that goes in and figures out the links and says this is fake or this is true? I mean, are there any research that you're aware of that's going in that direction?
Use of social media was not something that we proposed in the draft revision 4. So we assigned that capability for an applicant reference to an individual that has awareness, knowledge about the circumstances for an applicant in the identity proofing process. And we didn't get questions about that or comments, but we'll look into that capability. It probably would be beneficial for us to be able to do some type of evaluation and research on that as well.
Especially in the visa situation, when people apply for visas, now many countries, including in Africa, are asking for them to share their social media credentials with them and give consent that they could look at your social media credential, so that, I mean, there are disturbing dimensions to this, including privacy, including the fact that there are people who don't exist on social media, and as a consequence, does that mean that we're going to penalize them? But the whole idea from a technical point of view, if we can formalize that identity proofing using other soft credentials or soft proofs of footprint and existence.
Yeah, and I would point out one of the things that we're introducing in the draft revision 4 is a lower level of assurance for identity proofing. We consider it IAL1 or low level of identity proofing, where there may not need to be the rigor of more substantial identity proofing, but can be used nevertheless by the online service in order to tie that individual to a claimed identity.
Right. Excellent. As you could see, there's quite a bit of interest, and I hope this is not the last time we're going to see you. I think we're going to see more of this wonderful team, and hopefully we will collaborate with the broader set of NIST individuals to bring a global view to identity management that includes the developed context and the developing context, which to me, digital identity is democratizing the two. I mean, in a way, the needs for digital identity in both economies are very, very similar. And so we are converging together in that direction, and hence we are now interacting with you more than we've done in the past. I do want to be cognizant of the fact that people have been with us for more than 3.5 hours, so I would like to put an end here. But thank you very, very warmly for the contributions that you've made to our community and to the state of digital identity in the world globally. We look forward to seeing you once again at another event, and hopefully in a physical context. And reminding people that on November 15, we are going to be addressing another hot topic of our times. Many of you have been wondering about is AI and its impact on identity management, impact on identity development, and impact on development in general. So stay tuned and come back on November 15, and let's take on another interesting topic with the same level of rigor that we've done in today. So with that, I thank everybody for having stayed with us this long, and wishing to see you again on November 15. Thank you. Thank you to the NIST team. Very warm